When one thinks about the history of the United States, the Falkland Islands are not the first thing that comes to mind. On the contrary, when one hears the name the Falklands, one sees in their mind's eye the adrenaline-filled drama of Sea Harriers and Skyhawks duking it out over the South Atlantic as Exocet missiles come streaking in over the waves, all to the soundtrack of Margaret Thatcher.
No, no, no.
Yet in the latter years of the 1820s, the United States was very much involved in the affairs of that tiny but hotly contested little archipelago off the coast of Argentina. However, it was not by their own volition, and it is somehow even more ridiculous than the Pig War. Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and variations thereupon. Happy birthday, America, and welcome to the second episode of our now three-part series, the creatively titled Every Time Someone Touched America's Boats, Part 2. In the first episode, we covered the first 100 years of US history, and every conflict in it that was caused by interfering with US commerce or directly attacking American boats. In this episode, we will be covering the next 100. In other words, from where we left off in the 1860s, all the way until the end of World War II. Now I know what you're thinking. You said there were only going to be 2 parts. Why is there now 3? Well, the simple answer is I hit page 50 and I still hadn't reached the 1970s. At some point, you just have to set a limit. It would be going on far too long and take way too much time to make. However, that turned out to be a blessing in disguise because it gives me the, shall we say, liberty to give certain events the justice they deserve, while also ensuring there isn't a gulf of quality in my content. In any case, like always with these videos, there are a couple of caveats. Due to the length of time we are discussing, the level of detail will be closer to something like Extra History or Blue Jay, rather than my usual super autistic deep dives. This is a video just for fun, and I suggest that you use it to guide your searches for scholarly work on the subjects if you want to know more. The other caveat is, well, we have to backtrack a bit, for 2 reasons. 1, to establish some great context as well as tell a funny story. We shall have to talk about the Falklands Expedition. And 2, I need a segue for the sponsor segment, because when talking about America and its boats, the first thing you need to do is talk about capitalism. Oh, also, in advance, I apologize for the lack of footage in this video, at least for the first half, because we're still in the late 1890s, and like with episode 1, there isn't a lot of footage of the events being discussed. So we're going to have to rely on photos and panning over artworks. But I did my best. Anyway, to the ad. Imagine, if you will, a game unlike any other. A game with AAA graphics and an endless amount of content to enjoy from PC or mobile. Well, you don't need to imagine it, because this video is sponsored by such a game. Raid Shadow Legends. That's right, boys. Raid is back on the channel, and they have an absolutely insane new event happening right now. Web of Corruption. Dark forces are on the rise. The armies of the undead begin to march, and at their head is Raid's newest champion, Vallaryn the Equalizer. And while his lore is enigmatic, his abilities are not. His versatility is insane, with heals, debuffs, and massive AoE attacks that do huge amounts of damage, and you can get him for free by logging in for 7 days during the Vallaryn Chase event from July 2nd to August 18th. You just have to make sure you start the event before July 31st and log in for 7 more days to earn gear and upgrades for him. As for me personally, I'm still on my heroic quest with my original and favorite hero, Axeman the Town Guard. He is on paper one of the worst units in the game, but I have him to the point where he can slay dragons. He has a family at home he needs to feed, and saving the realm is just another day on the job for him. These are just some of the adventures you can have in Raid Shadow Legends, so for those of you who haven't joined up, what are you waiting for? Scan my QR code or click the link in the description to get amazing bonuses that you can only get through my link. You get 3 free legendary champions and 1 free epic one, not to mention a massive starter pack with Wythir the Crowned from the Demon Spawn faction. Not only does she look cool, she is massively useful with AoE heals, and also for you existing players, you can use one of these 2 promo codes listed here for bonus items, which is pretty rad. So make sure you download the game on PC, mobile or Mac, log in for 7 days to get your legendary champion, and if you reach level 10, you can get this absolutely hench guy named Fahrakin the Fat. I mean, just look at him. Or if you want something different, you could use one of these 4 promo codes. Get Alice, Femo, Super Victory, or Wrath to get their respective free champion of your choice. I'd personally pick Alice because, you know, come on, look at her. And all you have to do is click the link down below or scan the QR code on screen. It helps support the channel and it helps you enter the world of Raid Shadow Legends. Now, back to the video. In 1829, 30 years before the end of last episode, a Franco-German businessman by the name of Louis Vernet had set up a colony on the island of East Falkland in the ruins of an old Spanish outpost bearing the moniker Port Soledad. For many years, this area had been a whaling harbour for the various seafarers and fishermen plying their trade in the hazardous southern seas. The Atlantic is a cruel and unforgiving mistress, so any civilized settlement able to provide safe harbour and a chance for resupply naturally became a local hub for anyone brave enough to sail out there. It hadn't always been constant, though. The islands had been constantly settled, yes, but then they were subsequently abandoned, then resettled. In fact, this rotating ownership had been going on for the past century. So even though Britain technically owned the islands after their victory in the Peninsular War against Napoleonic Spain, Argentina, as an independent colonial administration, also laid claim. Thus, when it had been abandoned in the 1810s, it had fallen into contention once again. Hence why Mr. Vernet had sought a new lease from the government in Buenos Aires to take ownership over the islands, rather than taking it up with London. This naturally pissed off the British, but pissing off the British is usually the best course of action historically, as that generally means you getting your freedom, or at the very least you get a decent business venture started. However, while pissing off the British is generally a matter of course, there is one country you don't want to piss off under any circumstances. A country whose most prized possession is their money. Money they earn and protect with their boats. And when Louis Vernet established ownership over the Falklands by establishing his capital of Port Louis, humbly named after himself, he used the ship he sailed in as his own naval flagship, arming it with 4 8-pounder cannons in order to enforce the other part of his plan. As mentioned before, whaling was the primary industry of the islands, followed closely by seal hunting and fishing. As such, given he technically owns the islands now on behalf of Argentina, all such commercial fishing operations around the Falklands were declared illegal, unless they give the colony, by which he meant him, a piece of the action. However, as one can probably imagine, this declaration was met with incredulity at first, followed by utter indifference among the various fishing fleets operating in the region. I mean, sure, you may say you own these waters, but you don't have the backing of Argentina or the Royal Navy, really. All you have is a piece of paper saying you own the place, so, quite frankly, let's be honest, you and whose navy, buddy? Enraged by this response, Vernet put to sea in his ship and sallied forth to enforce his authority. Except he knew that the Royal Navy was the single most powerful military entity on the planet at the time, freshly expanded after the Napoleonic Wars, and beginning to leverage the newest technology available. Steam power. Not to mention long-ranged rifled guns that would turn his ships to matchwood. It was very clear that picking a fight with them would be seriously unwise. Thus, he decided to pursue targets he figured would be far softer and less likely to incur reprisal, as their host nation wouldn't bother sailing one of their very few capital ships down to do anything about it. Though, given the title of this video, I think you can see where this is going. In July of 1831, Vernet and his crew of impromptu Coast Guardsmen seized the US whaling vessel Harriet under Captain John Davison of Stonington, Connecticut, taking the crew as prisoner. Then, not satisfied with taking just one ship, on August 17th, he seized another from the same fishing company, the US fishing vessel Breakwater. Except due to finding out about the previous incident, Captain Carew of that ship was far more prepared and successfully drove off the boarding party, escaping back to the East Coast to report what was going on. However, it takes time to get back to the United States from the South Atlantic, and Vernet wasn't about to let the matter go, especially after losing the potential bounty from the Breakwater. So he found another US ship, the Superior, under Captain Stephen Cogan from New York, and once again, he took the ship by force, treating the crew, and I quote, rather shabbily. And then, on top of all of that, he had the gall, the cheek, and the unfathomable nerve to sail the Harriet back into Buenos Aires, claiming it as a rightful prize under international maritime law. Suffice to say, the American consulate under Diplomatic Consul George Slocum lodged a formal protest to the Argentine government, claiming that, quote, Louis Vernet, being guilty of piracy and robbery, should be handed over to the United States for immediate judgment. Yet, of course, due to Buenos Aires A, giving Vernet permission to be there, and B, the actual US ambassador having died and not been replaced yet, the Argentinian administration told Slocum that they don't have to listen to a lowly consul and that the US hasn't got any jurisdiction down here anyway. Or, in other words, pound sand. Now, given the United States is busy with its first forays into colonialism, westward expansion, the completion of the genocide against the indigenous Americans, and of course the US Navy still hasn't fully recovered from Revolutionary War II 1812 Boogaloo, this seems like a perfectly reasonable gamble to make. America is still finding its feet, even with all the glorious triumphs they achieved in the 18th century. But they had made one fatal error in their calculations. They forgot who the President of the United States in 1831 was. The President of the United States in 1831 was Andrew motherfucking Jackson, one of the most egotistical, turbo-racist imperialist warmongers in American history, who upon hearing that some random Frenchman was touching their boats, oh man, it wasn't just on, it was on for young and old. His once-removed predecessor, President James Monroe, had instituted the Monroe Doctrine, essentially claiming the entire Western Hemisphere of the planet as America's sphere of influence, declaring that any imperial intrusion in the Americas from the other world powers would be interpreted as a hostile act against the United States. And while this was easier said than done, it was official US government policy, and although the declaration bore Monroe's name, Andrew Jackson was going to be the guy to enforce it. Back in June of 1831, the USS Lexington had been forward deployed to Rio de Janeiro to protect American interests. So when all of this went down, Captain Silas Duncan, the commander aboard Lady Lex, was ordered to the Falklands to put an end to this nautical nonsense. And put an end to it he did. After making a quick port of call in Buenos Aires to voice the United States' displeasure, USS Lexington pulled into the harbour of the renegade settlement on December 28, 1831, and after a few days of posturing on New Year's Day 1832, the men of the United States Navy did the following, quoting from her log now. Early in the morning of the first day of the year, we made for the port of St. Louis and came to anchor at 11:30 a.m. Just prior to anchoring, we sent a landing party of 2 officers and 15 men ashore in the commandeered schooner to confer with the authorities, followed by another party at 11:45, well armed in 2 boats to augment the first. The 3 schooners were finally liberated and permitted to proceed. Practically all of the American citizens in the islands desired to leave, and Commander Duncan agreed to give them passage to Montevideo aboard the Lexington. While they were preparing for their departure, he met a guard of 12 mariners ashore to protect their property, and to assist them in their preparations for the voyage. The guard returned at noon the following day, but a smaller guard went ashore each day until the 5th. On the 21st, those Americans who wished to leave the island came aboard the Lexington and were made as comfortable as conditions on board a man-of-war would permit. The following day, the party consisted of 20 men, 8 women, and 10 children, sailed on board the Lexington for their native land. Vernet, despite being considerably outgunned, nevertheless protested and demanded the Americans respect his sovereignty. The Americans replied with, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Lol, no." At which point the newly liberated crews of the commandeered vessels ransacked Vernet's property for spoils as compensation, the lion's share going to Captain Davison of the Harriet to recoup his lost profits. For the next half a century, Vernet and his family would constantly lobby both the Argentine and the British government for compensation, arguing that they were a legitimate business venture, brutally robbed by the Yankee devils. The British took over the Falklands in 1833 and supposedly inherited all of his property. However, in his insurance claim, he claimed ownership of everything on the island at a total value in excess of £20,000. In the end, after a decade of legal battles that continuously went in circles between the 3 governments, the British Crown awarded him a claim of £2,400 with a forfeiture of all future claims, which is the legal equivalent of "I will pay you $20 to fuck off." And he did. His kids, however, didn't. They kept filing claims with everyone, repeatedly, as in they were filing cases monthly, legal injunctions and claims monthly, until eventually the Argentinian government also paid them token compensation. However, in 1885, it was deemed politically expedient for Argentina to pursue these legal claims as an argument for sovereignty over the Falklands against England, and so they reopened the cases diplomatically on behalf of the Verne family, only for then President of the United States Grover Cleveland to turn around with America's now substantially larger navy and politely ask them to reconsider. As did the British, who had, let me check my notes here, the single largest navy in the entire world equipped with state-of-the-art ironclads. Needless to say, discretion was considered the better part of valor, and the issue remained in contention until the 1980s, when Her Majesty's Armed Forces settled the issue. Decisively. To this day, however, Louis Verne is considered a folk hero in Argentina. He was granted the honorary title of Military Governor of the Falklands, and serves as a symbol of sticking it to both the British invaders and the imperialist Yankees. Oh, and speaking of Yankee imperialism... That's right, boys, we've mentioned it, and now we're doing it. The long-awaited Monroe Doctrine cinematic universe is about to start, so buckle the fuck up. By July of 1854, the United States had gone through its very first test of the now infamous foreign policy strategy mentioned in the title, by engaging in what would become a long-standing American pastime: fucking around in Nicaragua. To cut a very long story short, because we will be here forever if I don't at least try to keep things brief, an American transport company operating passenger and cargo services throughout the region, known as the Accessory Transit Company, ran a very profitable line across the Nicaraguan isthmus. Scattered all across the country, there are many rivers and inlets leading into the large lake in the middle of Nicaragua, known, very creatively I might add, as Lake Nicaragua. Before Big Stick Teddy built the Panama Canal, to get to the west coast from the east coast either required a long and dangerous journey across the continent through the actual Wild West, complete with the stereotypical cowboys and Indians, or a painfully long and only mildly safer journey around the southern tip of the continent and up the other side. However, the enterprising souls of the ATC, operating out of Greytown in the colony of Mosquita on the Atlantic coast, realized that if they set up a steamboat line going up the various rivers and across Lake Nicaragua, it was only a quick carriage ride from the western banks of the lake to the Pacific ports on the other side. So they started offering cheap passage through the country for people from the east coast of the US to transit across Nicaragua and hop on a ship heading for California from the other side. An excellent business model that worked absolutely brilliantly. Right up until the point the British Empire reasserted their claim to the region from Spain and took over the colony of Mosquita. This naturally didn't go over well with the Americans, but as a free enterprise they didn't really have to worry about too much. They just changed who they bribed. Only now they were subject to British laws. And let's just say the Americans were a bit more, shall we say, flexible with how they treated people of different races. So when a captain operating a steamboat for the ATC, while having a representative of the US government on board at the time, shot a Nicaraguan boatman for the crime of not getting out of his way fast enough. And as you can imagine, when that happened, things started to escalate rather quickly. The British, quite rightly I might add, wanted to try the man for murder, but the US government pulled the Monroe Doctrine diplomatic immunity card and interceded. That intercession taking the form of US Minister to Nicaragua, Solon Borland, exercising his Second Amendment rights and pulling a gun on the local cops when they tried to arrest the steamboat captain. This had the rather predictable result of pissing off everyone in Greytown who just had one of their neighbours gunned down by a foreign power, who then immediately laid siege to the Minister Borland's house and threw shit at him, with one resident throwing a shattered glass bottle that gave him a nasty laceration to his cheek. This was followed by the vandalism of ATC's property, which included their boats and the beginning of a potential labor dispute. Now, how do you think the Americans took this? Did they realize it was their fault? Did they apologize and withdraw their minister while compensating the family of the man they killed? Did they return the murdering steamboat captain to the United States as punishment in lieu of a trial to keep the tensions down? No. The Secretary of the Navy, James Dobbins, immediately declared the assault on Minister Borland a violation of the Monroe Doctrine and ordered the USS Cyan under Captain George Hollands to sail to Greytown immediately in order to extract reparations from the British colonial authority to the tune of $24,000 US, which adjusted for inflation is roughly $1 million US today. And so, on July 12, 1854, Captain Hollands issued these demands offshore of the colony, stating that unless their terms were met within 24 hours, retribution would follow. Needless to say, the poor Nicaraguan colonists, led by low-ranked British administrators, don't have that kind of cash just lying around, and immediately fled to the surrounding countryside. Thus, despite receiving orders not to use excessive force, Captain Hollands opened fire on Greytown, expending 177 shells into the port facilities before deploying his contingent of US Marines who, in the finest traditions of their service, trashed, looted and burned the entire town to the ground. Miraculously though, no one died and honor was deemed satisfied, so the US Navy went home and let the State Department deal with the fallout, which, as you can imagine, was considerable. The British were quite rightfully pissed, but what was even worse, and arguably funnier, is that due to the route, a good number of the businessmen in Greytown were American, who immediately sued the government for damages. Yet would you believe it, in a decision that we would absolutely never, ever see again, the Supreme Court ruled that as the President had ordered it, the action was completely legal, because the President ordered it, essentially meaning that the President of the United States can burn down your property and kill your employees with no financial or legal recompense to you, as long as it's deemed essential to America's continued national security. And who defines that vitality to national security? Why, the federal government does, of course. A government operating under the orders of the President. Man, what an awfully corrupt system. The conflicts of interest would be insane. It's like the federal government could use the military to protect corporate profits and then screw over average citizens and small business owners because they say so. It's a good thing the United States has evolved since then. On a completely unrelated note, this man is Edward Augustus Hopkins, a man described by scholars, and more importantly his Wikipedia page, as egotistical, arrogant, chauvinistic, swaggering, bullying, tyrannical, quarrelsome, pugnacious, imprudent, aggressive, and a product of nepotism. In other words, the perfect man to be given a diplomatic posting to South America, where he has to deal with dictators. President Buchanan is a man of many ideas. None of them are good ones. He's lucky Woodrow Wilson exists, because otherwise he's a strong contender for the worst president in American history. Anyway, Edward Hopkins was originally appointed as a goodwill ambassador to Paraguay by then Secretary of State Buchanan in 1845. Keywords there: goodwill ambassador, not actual ambassador. He had no diplomatic authority of any kind. His job was to just go around representing American business interests while sending regular telegrams to the State Department to keep them updated on happenings inside the country of Paraguay. Basically, make friends with government officials, attend the right parties, and show everyone how great Americans are. But Mr. Hopkins, as we established just now, has an ego. And much like another blustering American nepo baby out of his depth in high office, he proclaimed himself South America's greatest diplomat, who's going to end all the wars in the region and make everyone rich. His impending greatness was going to be, one might say, huge, or even bigly. So the moment he got there, he immediately tried to settle the long-standing disputes between Paraguay and its neighbours. Why? Well, apart from the prestige he'd gained from such efforts, he was already in talks with major business conglomerates and various investors back home in the United States. And if he could calm the region down while building his reputation, he could position himself as a corporate contractor or even a potential CEO for the various railway and mining companies that would inevitably set up shop in the country should the geopolitical situation stabilize. Thus, he opened diplomatic channels with the dictator of Argentina, Juan Manuel de Rosas, who, it has to be said, was a proper piece of shit, with death squad, suppression of the free press, standard South American El Presidente stuff. But nevertheless, he was in charge, and so Edward made his pitch. Through the American representatives in Buenos Aires, he proposed a complete restoration of American trade, normalized relations, a military alliance to stop the Anglo-French intervention against his forces in neighboring Uruguay, a free pony, the keys to the city of New York, a map to the lost city of El Dorado, a gold pass to the Playboy Mansion, and a lifetime subscription to Amazon Prime. In exchange for which, all he has to do is just recognize Paraguay as an independent state and agree to stop trying to invade it. Now at this point, two things happen. First, the ambassador to Buenos Aires, William Brent, lost his fucking mind. What do you mean this guy with absolutely no authority is suddenly offering Rosas the diplomatic and trade equivalent of a blank check from the United States? El Presidente Rosas, meanwhile, looked at these proposals, heard the meltdown coming from the US Embassy across the street, and then used his critical thinking skills to determine that Edward's proposals were utter horseshit. A determination he made abundantly clear to Edward in a very snarky thanks but no thanks communique. And given what we know about Edward's temperament, combined with his similarities to a certain contemporary American political leader, you can probably guess what happened next. Edward snapped in a properly bipolar fashion. He was incensed, enraged that this tin pot dictator would dare mouth off to the illustrious high office of Goodwill Ambassador and US Special Agent to Paraguay. So he wrote a self-declared official diplomatic letter in response. And I quote, "I know that not in the wide world have you a man as a friend in whom you can confide, nor is there one among your own countrymen who will speak to you what he thinks and feels. I want you to listen to one who dares to tell you what he feels and knows, so that if you are a man who loves American principles and liberty, you will meditate long and deeply upon it. Show the world an example of moderation, and it will speak well for your heart and your head." Basically, in passive-aggressive diplomatese, you're an authoritarian tyrannical piece of shit who has no friends, and I'm better than you in every way. Accept my deal or face the consequences. Keep in mind, he has no diplomatic credentials whatsoever, yet now he has issued an official diplomatic note insulting an authoritarian dictator who makes war on his neighbors on behalf of the United States. Needless to say, Washington issued an official retraction and an apology to Rosas, clarifying that this man was basically just an American PR guy and not an actual diplomat, followed immediately by recalling Edward and summarily firing him in 1846. And thus, relations returned to normal. Nothing untoward happened, everything calms down, and South America is looking nice and peachy. Until 1853, when James fucking Buchanan, despite having been responsible for this shit show in the first place, uses his influence to support Edward's application to become the official, diplomatically recognized, full card-carrying Congress guy, the US consul to Paraguay. An appointment he got because he was the only man to apply. And why did he apply to do it? For the same reason as last time. A cabal of wealthy investors from Rhode Island wanted to start a similar venture to the accessory transit company in Nicaragua, the United States and Paraguay Navigation Company, a business concern planning to operate steamships, trading posts, and various other fixer roles in Paraguay. And who better to run it than the American who knows every mover, shaker, and proverbial candlestick maker in the country? Edward Hopkins. So he got himself appointed as US consul while simultaneously holding a corporate office with a massive conflict of interest, and set off to Paraguay in June of 1853. Only for the ship carrying all the necessary equipment to set up their first branch office to get shipwrecked on its journey down the eastern seaboard. Bugger. Well, that's alright though. He's US consul now. He's a recognized diplomatic official this time, so he can use actual influence to his own advantage. And the first order of business in this new business endeavor is, as always, befriend the dictator in charge, one El Presidente Carlos Lopez. And although he was far more progressive than other Latin American leaders of the period, including abolitionist policies, economic liberalism, and modernization efforts to end the isolationist policies of the previous administrations, he was still corrupt, authoritarian, and the de facto ruler for life with his fingers in the pies of pretty much every industry in the country. After all, a big perk of the modernization and improved trade relations was the introduction of corporate capitalism, and he is the top 1%, with nary a Benicio Sandinista in sight, on account of the fact that he had them all killed. This sounds just like the type of guy who would appreciate an entrepreneurial mind like Edward Hopkins, who introduced himself as the US consul, took out a business loan of 11,400 pesos from the Paraguayan government, and then used his connections with Lopez and the business community back home to start setting up various businesses, including a sawmill and a cigar factory, which he staffed by levying the government for a very advantageous labor contract. By which I mean prison labor, conscripted labor, and indentured servants that definitely aren't slaves, we promise. In exchange for which, a portion of the proceeds would go to President Lopez personally, as well as legitimately levied taxes to the Paraguayan government. TLDR, it was a massive Ponzi scheme filled with embezzlement, government corruption, and militant suppression of labor unions. So, situation normal for South America when American corporations get involved anyway. However, Mr. Hopkins couldn't just let a good thing stay a good thing. The prestige of his post as consul meant he held significant political influence, which meant he went to all the best parties, wherein he ran his fucking mouth incessantly, talking about how he will change Paraguay's future and civilize the country. Apparently, his arrogant boasting was so bad, he actually floated the idea of being appointed an admiral in the non-existent and landlocked Paraguayan Navy so he could sail down the River Paraguay to Argentina and kidnap Rosas. All he'd need is a small loan of 100,000 pesos. I swear I can get it done, just leave it to me, Chief. I can do it, we can go down there, we can get this guy, it'll be great. This naturally didn't go down well with President Lopez, who interpreted this as undermining his authority and insulting the nation of Paraguay. Yet he can deal with this as long as he kept cutting him in on the action from his various businesses. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, it was all basically a Ponzi scheme. Debts were going unserved, bribes were getting less frequent, and all he got back from Edward was his only expeditious quality: copious amounts of hot air. Tensions were rising, and relations with the United States were degrading, despite the fact that Lopez actually wanted to improve diplomatic and economic ties with America to support his modernization plans. This went to the extent that he was actually preparing to negotiate and ratify a Paraguay-American Treaty of Friendship. However, the interference of Hopkins and multiple errors in the text of the treaty, not to mention the insulting requirement that it be signed exclusively in English, had stalled the diplomatic process, and quite reasonably, Lopez was getting properly angry. The entire situation was one giant interpersonal and diplomatic powder keg. All that was needed was a spark. Introducing the USS Water Witch.
And here we go.
While all of this was going on, unbeknownst to Eddie Hopkins and the gang, Rosas actually loses a war against Brazil and has to flee as dictator of Argentina, ending up in the United Kingdom of all places, leaving a brand new regime in charge, who in an effort to improve their position and gain some legitimacy, open up to the United States, allowing US Navy ships to traverse the region once again, and crucially, one of the waterways opened up to them was the South Atlantic estuary into the River Paraguay, allowing direct maritime trade from the United States to enter the landlocked nation. Thus, to enhance the prestige of the United States, carry out navigational surveys and scientific research in the South American hinterland, open business negotiations with the various trading companies operating along the myriad of rivers in the region, and above all, engage in gunboat diplomacy by demonstrating the might of the United States Navy. Congress authorized the USS Water Witch under Lieutenant Thomas Jefferson Page to sail down to South America and show the flag across the continent, completely oblivious to everything going down in Paraguay. Now, it should be noted that the Water Witch was chosen precisely because she wasn't a super heavy-duty ship of the line. She is an experimental paddle steamer with a very small draft. She only displaces 7 feet in total, meaning she can travel up and down waterways most warships can't. Ideal for traveling up and down the rivers. The problem with this, as you can probably surmise, is that she has no armor and only 3 bronze 32-pounder howitzers. They had big shells but fired slowly and had limited range. They were there for self-defense rather than a pitched battle. Nevertheless, it was deemed sufficient, and so the USS Water Witch sailed for Buenos Aires, arriving to a warm welcome by the Argentinians. Then, after some diplomatic schmoozing, they carried on up the River Paraguay to the capital of Ascension in October of 1853. Things started off well, everything was going great. Hopkins was being a pain in the ass, but it wasn't too bad yet. America was still a prospective ally, and so a huge party was laid on for the US sailors. Captain Page was given a full diplomatic welcome, all the bells and whistles, gifts were exchanged, the whole shebang. Then, after this was done, it was time to talk business. Page informed Lopez of his mission in South America to survey all of the rivers in the region and establish business ties while waving the US flag for all the local nations to see. The problem was, as we've established, that Paraguay was in a cold war with literally everyone around them, especially the Empire of Brazil, who refused to recognize Paraguay's territorial claims and constantly threatened a military confrontation as settlers from Brazil kept moving into the country and then starting firefights with the local authorities. But the terrain in South America is very mountainous and densely foliated, so any large-scale invasion of Paraguay would have to be done via the rivers. And if the Americans suddenly show up with a big warship cruising freely in and out of Paraguayan territory, that sends out a diplomatic signal that the River Paraguay is open to international traffic, which the Brazilians could use against them as leverage in negotiations, or worse, to launch a surprise invasion. So when Captain Page asked politely to sail upriver and map out the various routes, Lopez granted them a passport solely for Paraguayan territory, telling him that the River Paraguay was considered their territorial waters and under their jurisdiction alone. Any violation of borders would be viewed very unfavorably. It's alright though. We've got the passport, we've resupplied, the Treaty of Friendship is back on the table, everything's looking great. And so the USS Water Witch set off upriver towards Brazil, charting all of the rivers and inlets, and, to quote his official mission statement, collected astronomical, weather, and magnetic observations along with geological, zoological, botanical, and mineralogical specimens. While doing this, he also opened dialogues with the local officials and businessmen while sending out shore parties to gather local intelligence. By the 25th of November, he had mapped out the length of the River Paraguay inside the country, including its tributaries, nooks, and crannies. Business ties were made, and things were looking good. And then he got even better news from one of his shore parties. As he'd been doing all of this, he'd sent a letter to the local Brazilian official in Mato Grosso, asking permission for the USS Water Witch to sail into Brazil as far as possible to complete their survey. This would open up the southern provinces of Brazil to maritime trade with the United States, and even more lucrative commercial opportunities. So the Brazilians readily agreed. However, this would inevitably infuriate Lopez, who specifically forbade him to enter Brazilian territory. But he had orders from Washington, and the Brazilians said it was fine, so, what real harm was there? Thus, Captain Page sailed the Water Witch all the way upriver to Carumba, almost 1,800 miles inland from Buenos Aires, and incredible scientific and diplomatic achievement, demonstrating excellent seamanship. Except now, he has to sail back to his supply base in Ascension and explain to Lopez that he violated his instructions, torpedoed his diplomatic initiatives with Brazil, and wants to continue using his capital city as a base despite doing all of that. It's okay though, we charted the whole river and got some excellent trade goods up north. Maybe we can give him some gifts, reinforce the friendship treaty, we can talk it out, it'll be fine. So they sailed back to Ascension, only to be met with a complete and utter clusterfuck. While they'd been off breaking treaties, making deals, doing science and shit, Edward Hopkins had been using the money he'd embezzled to start running a real estate scam, buying up properties with loans and then using them as collateral for more loans, speculating, hustling, and doing all kinds of shady shit. Furthermore, the corporate backers from Rhode Island, having suffered serious losses, were making noises to the Paraguayan government about payments for assumed damages in the country. And then, just to top it all off, Hopkins's brother, who for some reason had decided to come along to Paraguay and grift on his brother's rep, got into a dispute with a squad of soldiers herding cattle while trying to rizz up the wife of the French consul by taking her on a romantic horse riding trip through the countryside. The soldiers asked him to give way for their herd, to which he refused. I mean, seriously, this is national importance. This is food for everybody. We have right of way, plus we got guns. He refused to give way. So the soldiers made him give way. In response to this perceived slight, Edward marched into Lopez's office on his brother's behalf with a riding crop in his hand and demanded the soldiers be punished, saying to Lopez he was a weak leader. What kind of fool would let his men run the country this way? And I swear, if you don't give me the proper respect, the might of the United States will be brought down upon you. I'm done negotiating. I'm gonna bring down the wrath. There's gonna be a hammer from God, the biggest hammer, the best hammer, the biggest hammer you've ever seen, etc. That was it. He'd had enough. He's done. Lopez exploded, told Edward to get the fuck out of his office, and declared the Hopkins personas non grata, withdrawing the diplomatic protection in the process. Furthermore, he demanded that all the shady dealings that he'd done with his support be remunerated in full to him, including the deeds to all the land he'd purchased, all the businesses he'd established, everything. This was no longer a minor diplomatic dispute. This was a full-scale, no-holds-barred international incident. And the USS Water Witch sailed right into the middle of it. When Captain Page arrived, he was told in no uncertain terms that Hopkins was no longer welcome in Paraguay. The Rhode Island Company, who officially ran his concerns, could send a new representative to work something out if they wanted, but Edward had to go. However, once again, there was one key caveat. I don't want any funny business this time. None of that bullshit you did like sailing to Brazil in November. No. Hopkins is not allowed to leave the country until he hands over the money he owes and the titles for all the land he bought. Until he does that, he will be held here indefinitely. You aren't going to scam me this time. Until this situation is resolved. No treaty, no passport for riverine navigation, nothing. Now, it has to be noted here that Captain Page actually hated Hopkins. But on the other hand, he is an American citizen representing the United States government, which left him in a quandary. On the one hand, this whole situation is entirely his fault, and the bastard deserves to get strung up by the Paraguayans for his actions. On the other hand, Page swore an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And Hopkins is a congressional appointee representing that Constitution. So, with the help of his Marine contingent, Captain Page ordered Edward be rescued from the Paraguayan authorities and brought aboard the USS Water Witch. Though in a gesture of good faith, he did submit all the required paperwork for his embarkation and passage, as well as all the permits necessary for their transit out of the country. Except, he submitted that paperwork in English, not in Spanish, operating on the same stubborn pride that prevented the Friendship Treaty from being ratified. This naturally pissed off everyone. The harbour master, the customs guys, the local cops, the magistrate, and especially President Lopez. They were all apoplectic with rage at this violation of their sovereignty, demanding Hopkins be returned to face punishment for his misdeeds and his attempt to escape, while also insisting on an official diplomatic apology. These demands were non-negotiable, and they will be met if the steadily assembling troops on the waterfront were anything to go by. Once again, they were at an impasse, a Mexican standoff without Mexicans, the egos of nations on the line, the very lives of the men involved resting on the outcome of the dispute. What was needed was a proportional response, not the meme definition, an actual proportional response, a dignified and deft diplomatic touch to resolve the issue without incident. And the man of the hour was Captain Thomas Jefferson Page, who responded to this unfolding disaster by training his howitzers on the presidential palace and proclaiming the inviolable sovereignty of a United States ship. It was only due to the fact that Lopez didn't want to torpedo relations with America that a war didn't start right there. In lieu of that, however, in September of 1854, he declared the River Paraguay closed to all military vessels from any nation without the explicit approval of his government, and ordered the USS Water Witch to leave immediately with prejudice. The United States Congress will be informed with an official diplomatic protest in due time when they come back to sort out the treaty. Now get the fuck out of my country. Realizing that they'd gotten away with it relatively unscathed, Captain Page promptly sailed south out of Paraguay and back into Argentina. It sucked that he couldn't continue his expeditions on the upper river, but there are still tons of rivers and inlets around Argentina that needed charting, so they relocated their main base to Buenos Aires to continue their mission. And so they would, steaming around the region, mapping out waterways, surveying natural resources, studying the wildlife, all perfectly legal naval activities. Until February 1st, 1855, when shit finally hit the proverbial fan. For you see, to cover the myriad of different creeks, inlets, and canals in this part of South America, Captain Page decided to split the crew up to cover more ground. With that in mind, he would take a small team in a yacht down the River Argentine, while his second-in-command, Lieutenant William Nichols Jeffers, would take the USS Water Witch and sail northeast up the River Parana towards Brazil. Now, looking at the borders of South America, it's all very confusing. But Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay all share a border despite it being completely impractical, and the Upper Parana lends its name to one of the southernmost Brazilian provinces. Jeffers' mission was to sail up this river, map it out, and establish good relations with the various officials in the settlements along the way for potential trade initiatives. There was just one tiny issue with this plan. That part of the river changes hands multiple times depending on which side of the river you are on. It's disputed territory between all three countries at various points along it, and while Argentina and Brazil were perfectly cool with the Water Witch, the Paraguayans, for obvious reasons, were not. Nevertheless, the Americans were undeterred and began steaming towards the inlet of the Upper Parana, separated from the River Paraguay by a northeasterly bend. And wouldn't you know it, at a strategic intersection of rivers on a contested international border, there was, and you'll never believe this, a fort. Specifically, Fort EPYRE, manned by an elite contingent of Paraguayan border guards. And yes, they actually were an elite unit due to the strategic importance of the position. It was the only part of the riverbank that wasn't an impenetrable swamp, standing at a crucial junction between three major rivers. Rivers Argentina or Brazil would have to use if they wanted to invade Paraguay. And of course, to sustain their invasion force logistically. So naturally, the Paraguayans claimed this part of the river as their sovereign territory, and therefore closed to any military vessel, regardless of origin. But Lieutenant Jeffers was undeterred. He had orders and he intended to follow them. Thus, the USS Water Witch steamed upriver without a care in the world, turning into the river bend past the Canal Privado, sovereign Paraguayan territory. Now, what happened next is contentious. The Americans say it was all Paraguay's fault. They were just a science vessel minding their own business, sailing down an international waterway. The Paraguayans, meanwhile, say that the Americans ignored their warnings, knew it was their territory, and deliberately chose to ignore that fact, violating their sovereignty with an armed military vessel, despite the decree they caused forbidding them entry. However, the evidence suggests that Lieutenant Jeffers knew it was Paraguayan territory, given the fact he ordered the starboard defensive gun moved to the port side and extra ammunition moved up to the deck, essentially putting his ship on a standby alert for battle stations. He was readying for combat, which he suspected was about to happen, which, when you consider the following events, feels like intentionally triggering an international incident. Anyway, on February 1st, 1855, USS Water Witch approaches the river bend into the Upper Parana with its guns armed and ready to fire in case they're challenged. At the same time, the garrison of Fort EPYRE have been put on higher alert status due to tensions with Brazil flaring up after last year's various diplomatic debacles, only to see an armed warship heading straight for them. The same warship that caused half of those problems. The same warship that resulted in the ban on military shipping entering their territory in the first place. Thus, at 1:20 p.m, they dispatch a canoe commanded by a junior officer to challenge the Water Witch's passage, hailing them down and ordering them to return to the Argentinian part of the river by handing Lieutenant Jeffers a copy of the declaration issued by President Lopez, forbidding military vessels from entering their territory. But Lieutenant Jeffers refused to accept the declaration due to it being written in Spanish. He had translators on board, not to mention locally recruited Argentine sailors to augment the crew, not to mention he's been operating in this area for months, so it's not like he couldn't read it. He rejected it on principle for the same reason Page and the State Department rejected the Paraguayan diplomatic notes issued to them previously. Nonplussed but powerless, the Paraguayans returned to the fort and USS Water Witch continued to head upriver, until they neared the fort itself, at which point the commander of the garrison hailed the Americans, ordering them to turn back. Lieutenant Jeffers ignores them and continues full steam ahead. So the Paraguayans fire a blank powder charge as a warning shot, telling them, "We aren't kidding, guys. Turn around now." And Lieutenant Jeffers responds by ordering his men to battle stations and manning the guns, which the Paraguayans can see from their position. In the immortal words of a great American warrior of our times, "Cowabunga it is." Fort EPYRE opened fire on the USS Water Witch, killing the helmsman with their very first shot. The Americans returned fire, but with only 3 obsolete howitzers, the effect of their bombardment was minimal. The Paraguayans, by contrast, had no problem with their 6 very large high-velocity shore batteries, blasting 10 sizable holes in her side and wrecking one of the paddle wheels. The fire was so accurate and so intense that the gun crews aboard ship deserted their posts and took cover. It was then that Lieutenant Jeffers did something incredibly stupid. Instead of trying to power through the ambush and suppress the enemy with return fire, getting out of the kill zone, he then turned around and ran back through the kill zone, taking even more damage. Realizing the Americans were withdrawing and having made their point, the Paraguayans ceased fire, and USS Water Witch limped back to Argentina to seek urgent repairs. The battle now over. The diplomatic and political blowback from this event was as instantaneous as it was immense. Captain Page, upon learning of the incident, rushed back to his ship and immediately resumed command. His first action upon doing so was to get in touch with the State Department through his superior officer and requested both reinforcements from the US Navy South American Squadron and permission to use them for a retaliatory strike. The response from Washington after a brief investigation was emphatic. "Yeah, no, Captain Page, you and your officers caused this entire shit show. This was all your fault. You got yourself into this, you can get yourself out." The mission was over. USS Water Witch was ordered home. The treaty negotiations stalled with no diplomatic representation in Paraguay, and President Lopez was in no mood to talk after a US ship he specifically banned violated his territory and fired on his men. The whole situation was, and there really is no other word for it, the defining example of a clusterfuck. Everything went wrong, solely because everyone involved was a complete moron. That said, it appeared to have been all wrapped up. It seemed pretty much done. With conciliatory diplomatic overtures and a year or two for everyone to cool their heads, things should work themselves out eventually. It should be fine. And it would have been. It would have been fine. If not for President James Buchanan. That's right. He's back, he's president now, and he's here to fuck it all up. President Buchanan, in his first annual address to Congress, executed the tried and tested necro bump maneuver. Shout out to my fellow millennials from the old web forum days. In making his inaugural speech to the House, Jimmy Boy brought up the dastardly deeds of the Paraguayans 3 years ago, expelling their diplomats and firing on US ships, refusing to deal with honest, hard-working American businessmen, honestly trading with the local Paraguayan companies. Something had to be done. Indeed, something did have to be done. The country was spiraling towards civil war. The southern plantation owners who formed part of his base were pissed at him for not making efforts to protect the institution of slavery. The Republicans were pissed at him for being a Democrat and as such, not stopping slavery. The economy was in the shitter, and the northern industrialists weren't getting the investments in South America they were promised. They had great dreams of railroads, mining operations, and giant cash crop plantations full of ethically sourced affordable labor. President Buchanan was up shit creek domestically, and he knew it. So he fell on the universal plan B of all American politicians. When things suck at home politically and you don't have a way out, go bomb some brown people. It always works. In order to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, defend America's honor, and finally secure our vital economic interests in the region, a US Navy task force would be assembled to escort a diplomatic official, the Right Honorable Judge James Butler Bolen, a no-nonsense Virginian Democrat who moved to St. Louis, Missouri and ran for Congress. Judge Bolen was to deliver the following demands to Paraguay. Apologize for shooting at the USS Water Witch. Apologize for telling our various diplomats to go fuck themselves. Pay compensation to the family of the US sailor you killed, and settle your financial dispute with the American industrialists from Rhode Island by honoring their claim for damages, with the amount of those damages to be paid totaling no less than $500,000 in 1858. For reference, that's roughly $20 million in today's money. Now, these are all, quite frankly, ridiculous demands, especially when you consider the entire situation was America's fault. Lopez wanted to be friends. You're the ones who fucked this all up. So when you do the math and it's all said and done, there's absolutely no way they're going to get what they ask for unless they use some serious leverage. So what exactly was this leverage? Nothing much. Nothing dramatic, really. Just a quarter of the entire US Navy. Yes, really. 7 warships, 9 commandeered steamers, 2 supply ships, including USS Supply herself, and a US Coast Guard ship, the Harriet Lane. In other words, a proportional response. What nobody knew, of course, except the commander, Commodore William B. Shubrick, was that half the ships didn't have enough ammo for a combat engagement, none of them were ironclads, and he only had 280 Marines available for ground operations. If shit went south, all he could really do was blockade the River Paraguay to cut off trade and take out the fort that fired on Water Witch. If he tried to invade Paraguay itself, they'd get slaughtered. But Lopez doesn't know that. All he'll see is one big giant fleet. So, in December of 1858, the Paraguay Expeditionary Force arrived in Montevideo, causing everyone in the region to shit bricks until Judge Bolen sent word that only the lightly armed steamer USS Fulton was going to enter the country of Paraguay in order to reach the capital for negotiations. The Paraguayans agreed. However, as they approached, basically the entire military, including their river patrol boats or their artillery, plus the fortress of Humatia and its shore batteries, were fully armed and facing them down as they passed. Once they got there and Judge Bolen greeted President Lopez with all decorum available, it was obvious that while the president was making a big fuss domestically about how the Paraguayans were devious scandals, the reality was the American diplomatic mission had been sent to settle the whole thing once and for all, while giving the president an easy win. Hopkins and Page were morons. They only got here because of nepotism in Washington. I mean, you know how it is, man. You're a dictator. A democratically elected president. You know how it is. You gotta keep everyone happy. Plus, we're on the brink of civil war, and we really can't afford this right now. Or, in other words, this is just a big smokescreen to basically just fix everything up. And Lopez knew they were bluffing anyway. But he wanted friends against Brazil and Argentina. Thus, negotiations went really smoothly. Bolen, being a lawyer, knows just how to spin enough diplomatic legalese to make Paraguay accept the blame for the whole Water Witch incident in the newspapers, while actually saying it was the Americans' fault. They agreed to pay compensation to the family of the helmsman to the tune of 10,000 pesos. The Treaty of Friendship was signed in both English and Spanish, complete with a cover sheet explaining that we'd actually wanted to be friends all along, it's just Hopkins fucked everything up. So us rejecting it wasn't our fault. And, just to finish off, in regards to the claims of the Rhode Island business conglomerate trying to sue them, an international arbitration comprised of representatives from each country would be convened in the United States to resolve the issue, with a third-party umpire on hand to mediate. Bolin had received orders from Washington that such an arbitration would be acceptable as long as it took place on terms favorable to the United States. They didn't specify the form or the wording, which Bolin phrased in such a way to force the issue to be settled fairly. So when the arbitration took place, everyone looked around and said, "Yeah, guys, look, the plaintiffs are corrupt pieces of shit. The Paraguayans paid up fair and square for the goods they purchased, and we have the receipts. Your claim is therefore groundless. The damages were a result of your incompetent Representative Hopkins, who abused his governmental position. We rule in favor of the defendant. Now go away." And thus, the whole thing was written off. James Buchanan got to claim victory, even though it didn't help him much. Paraguay got an ally. The idiots who caused this debacle all got fired, and the corpo assholes trying to screw them didn't get a cent. A win all round. If only all diplomatic misunderstandings could be resolved this well. Especially when that misunderstanding is one of mistaken identity. The year of 1866 is a watershed moment in the history of Korea. Like Japan, the Koreans had taken the sensible, if slightly self-sabotaging decision to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. A decision they took largely for their own safety in the face of the various imperial powers of the region trying to occupy them. Japan especially. During the Imjin Wars of the 1590s, they only narrowly avoided becoming a satellite state of the rising sun, largely thanks to their revolutionary turtle ships commanded by a very belligerent admiral named Yi, and the support of their overlord. That overlord, of course, being China, who were generally content to leave the Koreans alone as long as they paid the occasional tribute and didn't cause any trouble. The more things change, the more they stay the same, huh guys? In any case, the Koreans of the 19th century had been watching the ongoing Chinese century of humiliation. The Opium Wars and treaty ports were steadily extracting every ounce of wealth from the once great empire, while the spread of Christianity sparked the Taiping Rebellion, where the self-proclaimed half-brother of Jesus Christ started a civil war that would prove to be the single bloodiest war in human history until World War II. You heard correctly. It was so deadly, some estimates place the death toll at between 20 to 30 million people. Given all this, and then combine it with the American intervention in Japan, causing their old enemies to industrialize under the Emperor Meiji, and the Koreans were ever so slightly on edge, to put it mildly. So they cut themselves off. Christianity was banned, any attempt to proselytize the gospel resulted in summary execution, and foreign trade was restricted solely to overland trade with China, with very few exceptions. Exceptions that were subject to a myriad of variables so obtuse, everyone just declared it impossible. This isolationism is what granted Korea its original Western nickname, the Hermit Kingdom. And they carried on like this until the aforementioned year of 1866. For in 1866, the Western world decided that if Korea wasn't going to come to Jesus, Jesus was going to come to Korea. An expedition of French Catholic missionaries operating undercover as journeyman academics or enterprising merchants made their way into Seoul and Pyongyang to spread the good news of the Lord. And while I can understand spreading the love of our Saviour Jesus Christ, there is a limit to how far I'd be willing to go, considering the risk of a very aggressive haircut should I get caught. But I guess that's why missionaries are missionaries, especially Catholic ones. They're insane. And martyrdom does give you a decent shot at sainthood if you pull off a miracle. Quite literally. However, unfortunately for the Frenchmen, they only managed the first half. They successfully introduced Catholicism to the Korean peninsula, with several thousand converts and a few underground churches. The problem being that you can't exactly introduce a new faith with the rigorous doctrines of Catholic Christianity without getting noticed. The Frenchmen were found out, arrested, and subsequently executed along with most of their parishioners. Only 3 of the priests managed to get away, escaping to the French mission in China to relay the fate of their colleagues. As all this was going on, another issue faced the Koreans. An issue we unfortunately still have to deal with today. Surprise Russians. After their eastern campaigns against China and the colonization of Siberia, Russia now shared a border with the Korean kingdom. Thus, a colonial mission sailed from Vladivostok to demand the right to trade with the kingdom and for Russian settlers to migrate into their border regions, because letting Russians set up colonies in your border regions never, ever leads to problems later. Needless to say, the Joseon Kingdom told them to fuck off and started sharpening their sticks. It was clear that the West was coming, whether they wanted them to or not. And it was a good thing they started sharpening, because in October of that year, Admiral Pierre-Gustave Roset arrived at the mouth of the Han River in between the Korean mainland and the large offshore island of Ganghwa. The French had no latitude for negotiation. They demanded reparations from the Koreans for the deaths of their missionaries, the release of any French citizens currently held captive, and, of course, the opening of diplomatic relations with the goal of pursuing trade. Shockingly, as pattern recognition would tell you, the Koreans said no, and the French response was predictable and most likely the one they desired. Admiral Roset ordered his force of 800 Marines to seize the island of Ganghwa and its capital city of the same name, ransacking the regional capital of its wealth in the form of over a ton of precious metals, several thousand muskets, the battle standards of the city garrison taken from their forts, and the entire contents of the island's royal library, including books, jades, artworks, and government documents. Things seemed to be off to a good start, yet their calculations were off by a significant degree in one key respect. They figured the Koreans would react much like the Japanese and the Chinese had done. Initial resistance followed by, well, you meet the new emperor the same as the old one, so I guess this is how it is now. The Koreans, however, as anyone who's met them can tell you, have more in common with their Vietnamese cousins than they do with the other countries in the region. And if you know what happened to the French after they pushed the Vietnamese too far, I think you can probably guess what happened next. The local Korean population of Ganghwa declared protracted people's war against the European occupiers, and local guerrilla fighters began relentlessly attacking any French formation they found. Reinforcements from Seoul started marching down the banks of the Han River as the coastal garrisons and fortress monasteries on the island started digging in deep and preparing for a siege. Admiral Roset ordered his Marines to take those forts before the main Korean force arrived so they could fight from prepared positions with the aid of naval gunfire, only for the Fusiliers Marines to get absolutely bodied by a regiment of Korea's elite troops, a unit known as the Tiger Hunters, resulting in 3 killed in action and 35 wounded, while achieving no progress whatsoever. So the French decided to try and take one of the smaller garrisons on the Korean mainland as a political objective, in order to exert pressure on the capital Seoul, only to be met with a hail of gunfire supported by heavy artillery. They had taken too long. The Korean main force of over 10,000 men had started to arrive, and worse still,
but winter is coming.
With the full force of an enemy they weren't expecting to fight bearing down on them, holds full of valuable loot, a lot of dead and wounded men crowding the decks, and the first snowflakes of winter collecting in their rigging, Admiral Roset followed the standard French protocol in such a situation. Declare mission accomplished à la victoire, proclaim the glory of France, take their booty, and run like hell before things get any worse. Thus ending the Great French Expedition to Korea of 1866. Now, I'm sure all of you are wondering, Animarchy, what in the hell does any of this have to do with the United States of America? Enter the SS General Sherman. Oh dear. As Korea was executing the Catholics and declaring unlimited genocide on the round-eyed barbarians, an American steamship bearing the name of William Slaveholders Make Great Cigar Holders Sherman was on a top-secret and ever-so-slightly illegal mission. For you see, after the opening of Japan kicked off the Meiji Restoration, it started an economic boom the likes of which the region had never seen or would ever see. Well, they'd see another economic miracle later for reasons. But we'll cover that eventually. We'll just have to get there when we get there. As such, it stood to reason that opening up isolated Asian countries was a fantastic business proposition and represented an entrepreneurial opportunity unlike anything else. And as we've established, When there is an opportunity to engage in reckless imperialist capitalism, you will always find some Americans close by. Anyway, the SS General Sherman was owned by a businessman from Boston and commanded by one Captain Page. No relation to the one from last chapter, but it's amazing there's so many of them. If I had a dime for every single captain named Page in the US Navy, I'd have a shitload of dimes. And this particular Captain Page's mission was ostensibly to trade with British wholesalers operating in China in order to start up an import business. However, in actuality, this was a cover for the crew's real goal: to open up a private, independent, non-state-backed trade mission with the Kingdom of Korea. Consider the possibilities. Consider the entrepreneurial opportunity. Consider what would happen if the Meiji Restoration had to go through just one corporation instead of being a government operation open to everyone. They would have a monopoly on exotic goods while acting as a fully independent diplomatic entity. Imagine an American East India Trading Company. It was a tempting proposition to any 19th century businessman. And so, after assembling a crew which included Chinese translators and pilots, along with Japanese and Malayan sailors, plus a Welsh Christian missionary they picked up somewhere along the way, the SS General Sherman set sail for the northern capital of Pyongyang with the thrill of adventure and dreams of incredible riches in their hearts. Only for them to arrive just as the 3 surviving French missionaries made their escape, meaning that the entire Korean military was on high alert and royally pissed off. Quite literally, given the imperial court were apoplectically furious and ordering the death of all the Christians in the country. But the Americans, having just arrived on their big shiny boat, had no idea any of this was going on, and as such, they did what Americans always do when entering a new country. They sailed up to the nearest population center, announced their presence while brandishing firearms, unloaded their cargo to make some sales, and then one of their group, in this case the Welsh missionary, starts handing out Bibles and asking the locals if they have a moment to talk about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. This did not go down well. Yet the Americans were not deterred. They were on a mission to get that bread. Thus, they began sailing up the Taedong River towards Pyongyang on August 16th, 1866, stopping at every village along the way to trade with the locals and hand out Bibles. Hearts, minds, and wallets were the name of the game, and they were playing to win. It was then, at that point, the imperial government, under Regent Dae Wong-yun, received reports of a heavily armed Western vessel sailing upriver to their capital, handing out Bibles and demanding trade negotiations. Now consider what's just happened from their perspective. We've just killed a bunch of French missionaries, but we know a few of them escaped. And now there is a heavily armed Western warship sailing towards the capital, spreading Jesus and capitalism. It's got to be the French, right? They're here to demand reparations or exact revenge, if not worse. We have to act, and we have to act fast. The governor of Pyongyang, Bak Gyul-soo, was dispatched to the scene by the imperial court to order the crew of the Sherman to immediately vacate Korea with all haste. Failure to do so would result in a full-scale military response with no quarter and their immediate execution. Thus, Governor Gyul-soo headed downriver to meet with the encroaching Frenchmen around August the 20th, while ordering the nearest senior official, Yi Hyun-ik, to initiate contact on his behalf. Sure enough, contact would indeed be made a week later on August 27th, as due to a rainstorm blanketing the region, the Taedong River began to swell into a torrent, which caused the Chinese pilot of the Sherman to misjudge the depth, causing the ship to run aground on a sandbar they didn't spot until the last minute. Given the circumstances, they wouldn't be going anywhere until the current picked back up, and so they sent out a foraging party in a dinghy to go ashore and grab some provisions, only to run into Yi Hyun-ik on the way, who was sailing towards them in his junk. Seeing a Korean military vessel sailing towards their stranded ship, the foraging party, who as a shore patrol were fully armed, immediately turned about and boarded Yi's ship, taking the bureaucrat prisoner at gunpoint along with his crew. As it usually happens with Americans operating out of their depth, things naturally and exponentially escalated. Thus, this trading expedition has now turned into a hostage negotiation. Once back aboard the Sherman, Yi relayed the message sent by the Imperial Regent to Captain Page, explaining the situation in the process and advising him to just drop him off while they hightail it out of here as fast as possible. Hey boys, just a heads up, you've walked into a clusterfuck and a half, and if you don't leave now, you're all gonna die. However, Yi at this point doesn't realize these aren't Frenchmen. He's working on the assumption that they will make the sensible decision once they realize what's happening, and in doing so, he has now made the second critical error after touching an American boat. He has tried to tell Americans what to do, which they never take kindly to, especially when it's in the form of a threat. Their response is to send one of the sailors from the junk they raided back ashore with a list of demands to be handed over to the recently arrived Governor Gyusu. Demands which included a large quantity of gold, silver, and rice, as well as several crates of ginseng, a medicinal herb you can chew, which gives you a buzz. Yes, it's the same old story as every Western expedition to Asia in the 19th century. Guns, drugs, and money. Except by now, news of the situation had spread to the nearby towns and villages. The nearby towns and villages who provided the crew for the junk. Which means news has come through that the husbands, brothers, fathers, and uncles of all the locals have been taken hostage by foreign devils invading their land. Foreign devils stuck on a sandbar and unable to escape. I think you can see where this is going. The local Koreans immediately raised their militias and launched an assault against the Sherman. Arrows, rocks, spears, and get this, they even whipped out the Hwachas. Yeah, remember that ancient multiple launch rocket system equipped with fire arrows they tested on Mythbusters back in the day? Yeah, they rolled up with several of those things and let fly, striking the vessel with several volleys. The Americans, having just come under fire from medieval rocket artillery, decided to promptly reply with their own, in the form of state-of-the-art 12-pound long-range howitzers, and started bombarding the shoreline, which kicked off a protracted artillery duel lasting several hours, killing 7 Koreans and wounding dozens more. Yet in this chaos, a hero would arise, a brave warrior who would cast out the American imperialists, a bastion of integrity, a pillar of the community, a local legend who, when the arch-enemy landed on Korean shores, abandoned his humble farming life and took up arms to defend the fatherland. As the Americans were deafened by their own cannon fire, a boarding party snuck aboard the stranded ship and engaged in furious hand-to-hand combat, rescuing Counselor Yi and several of the hostages before making a daring escape. This boarding party was led by none other than Kim Ung-yu, grandfather of our glorious supreme leader, Kim Il-sung, who would then destroy the Americans with fire ships he designed and built, proving once again that nothing can stand in the way of our righteous might and the glory of Juche and Korean socialism. Of course, the actual rescue mission was led by a non-commissioned officer by the name of Park Chong-won, and there is no historical record of Kim Ung-yu being anywhere in the area. But the North Koreans have never let the facts stand in the way of a good national myth. In any case, the Americans had lost their leverage and killed Korean citizens. The time for talk was over. Governor Gyusu gave orders for the army to march from Pyongyang, while the Navy pulled a trick out of the Oliver Hazard Perry book of warfare and started building an impromptu turtle ship upriver mounted with the biggest cannon they could find. The problem came when on September 1st they sailed up to the Sherman and fired at it, only to discover that the American ship was an ironclad and simply shrugged off the hits, which was immediately followed by return fire that did serious damage and drove them back. Thus, a stalemate broke out. The Koreans couldn't hurt the Sherman, but the Sherman can't defeat the huge force of Imperial troops starting to congregate. Nor could they run away given the river had gone down, leaving them beached on the sandbar, and due to the enemy force besieging them, they were unable to disembark and start engineering a way to get it free. What we had between the Americans, the Korean military, and the citizens' militia was, as the saying goes, once again, a Mexican standoff without any Mexicans. At least I don't think there were any. Eventually, though, as legend has it, Comrade Kim Ung-yu, with his ingenuity, lashed together the villagers' canoes and made fire ships to destroy the imperialist invaders. Again, no. The villagers themselves did that with the aid of the soldiers. And while their first effort failed, the second and third fire ships hit the Sherman dead on, setting it alight, cooking off the powder aboard, and turning the stranded vessel into a blazing inferno that eventually burned to the ground, leaving just its ironclad frame, that would subsequently be scrapped by the locals. And as for the crew, well, some of them burned alive trapped below decks, some of them drowned in the river, and the rest... You guys ever seen Black Hawk Down? Yeah. So as far as the United States was concerned, the SS General Sherman just straight up disappeared with no explanation, while Korea immediately forgot about it due to the aforementioned French invasion that happened a month later. Though they were probably wondering why they bothered sending one ship ahead of the main force all on its own. To everyone involved, basically, the entire incident was just a footnote. The United States was in the middle of Reconstruction and westward expansion. They were fighting the Indian Wars, completing the genocide of the Native Americans in the process. Then they had the rise of the KKK, economic devastation from the war in the South, combined with a market adjustment due to all the military contracts drying up. There was a massive economic crisis in the aftermath of the Civil War, and as such, they quite understandably had way bigger priorities than a bunch of random adventurers going missing in Korea. But nothing lasts forever. Nothing except capitalism. To quote the Ferengi rules of acquisition,
"The 10th rule of acquisition is greed is eternal."
In 1868, an expedition led by a German business magnate, Ernst Oppert, financed by an American investor named Jenkins, initials EFB, I couldn't find his name, sailed to Korea to, and I swear I'm not exaggerating or making this up, dig up the corpses of Korean royalty and ransom their remains back to them in exchange for opening the country to foreign trade, working on the assumption that as the Koreans, like China and Japan, practice a tradition of filial piety, the remains of their royals would be held sacred. So, they preemptively sent a ransom note, snuck into Korea, found the most important mausoleum they could, and tried to steal the remains inside, not realizing that the remains they were trying to steal were that of the previous emperor, meaning the current emperor would be issued a demand for ransom over the grave of his father. And as someone who has recently lost his father to a heart attack, if someone stole my dad's ashes and then tried to ransom them to me, the only ransom they will end up wanting is for me to put them out of their misery when I'm done with them. And that is exactly the response they got. Because when the grave robbers tried to steal the former emperor's remains, the locals had alerted the local garrison of the incursion, so they hightailed it out as fast as possible, got back on their boats, and sailed further down the western coastline to find an easier target, only to find out that the emperor had essentially declared war on Ernst personally, because half the Korean army was there to meet them. And here I thought that honor was reserved for Napoleon. But I guess if you piss off someone who's important enough to make that declaration, you've already distinguished yourself in that regard. Ernst and Jenkins tried to bluff their way out of the situation, saying that the full might of Europe was behind them. But no dice. They weren't falling for that. They've seen this game before. Their co-conspirators on shore were executed, and they were forced to run for their lives. What's important here, though, is, as all this was going on, the Koreans had to notify their liege lords of the Qing dynasty in China what had been happening in their kingdom, and why so many rumors, refugees, and corpses were showing up in China, which naturally filtered its way through to the European missions in China, which meant the Americans found out what had happened. So they sent a diplomatic envoy aboard the USS Shenandoah to get official confirmation as to the fate of the SS General Sherman. When they arrived, they got given a translated copy of exactly the same letter they sent to the Chinese, explaining the whole thing, apologizing for the inconvenience, and assuring the Americans that the whole thing was just a misunderstanding. These weren't representatives of your government, they were a free enterprise and they broke our laws while attacking our villages, and so our people were so enraged they broke free of our control and killed them in retaliation. It was a complete shit show on all sides, and we just want to write it off and pretend it never happened. As far as Korea is concerned, we're chill. Just don't try to tell us about that Jesus guy again, okay? We're not interested. They were, of course, lying about that last part. They had, in fact, ordered the villagers to burn the ship and kill everyone. But lying to keep the peace is basically the definition of diplomacy, so everyone went along with it, and it was all good. Satisfied, the USS Shenandoah sailed back to the headquarters of the US Navy's Asiatic Squadron, cabled Washington the message, and that appeared to be that. However, as we know by now, they had committed the cardinal sin. What's worse, they'd committed it at a time when punitive expeditions were the standard operating procedure of the United States Navy. The first ever combat action between the United States and Vietnam happened when they sailed into the port of Quy Nham unannounced, looking for a missing ship, only to scare the living shit out of the Vietnamese shore batteries who were, like the Koreans, paranoid about French colonial forces, quite rightly as it would turn out. So they opened fire. The Americans, after attempts at communication failed, fired back, destroying the fort, and then sailed away acting like they don't know nobody. A similar thing happened in Fiji around the same time, as well as an expedition to Formosa, now known as Taiwan, though that one didn't go very well. All in all, the United States Navy was bouncing back, fresh off those sweet Civil War tax dollars, and they were itching to throw their weight around. And so, we find ourselves in the year of our Lord, 1871. The US involvement in China and Japan is well underway. American corporations are making a killing. Reconstruction is going badly, and the United States is starting to get into the empire game for real. The State Department and the struggling Grant administration desperately needs a win. Therefore, they look at their map, look at the roaring success of their Asian business sector and go, hey, we achieved a massive breakthrough when we opened up Japan and our South American ventures kind of went sideways. How about we go back to Asia and break into the one place no one has managed to crack yet? So they telegram the Chinese government, and the conversation goes a little something like this. Hey, so we know Korea is technically your vassal state, but we really want to get involved here. Do you mind if we go have a talk to them, maybe with a fleet of warships, kind of like we did last time? Yeah, just smooth things out. To which the Chinese responded, What, Korea? Dude, we don't have anything to do with Korea anymore, and even if we did, we can't afford it. We currently have a massive drug epidemic to deal with thanks to your parents, so, I don't know, whatever, go nuts. Thus, permission granted, American ambassador to China, Frederick Lowe, set sail at the head of a task force commanded by Commodore John Rogers, comprised of the steam frigate USS Colorado, the sloops of war Alaska and Benicia, which were in turn escorted by a pair of gunboats, Palos and Monocacy, totaling 5 ships in all, with a contingent of between 100 to 150 Marines. And on the 23rd of May 1871, they arrived in style off the western shores of Korea, sailing up to the mouth of the Han River near the island of Ganghwa, just as the French had done. And just like before, the reaction from the Koreans was immediately hostile. Western devils. What's worse, it's the same Western devils whose first instinct was to take our emissary hostage and shoot guns at us. But despite their better judgment, they can't just go around shooting at people. That's what the foreign devils do. That's how you start international incidents. So after a few tense interactions with the local villagers, the Koreans follow protocol and send a local government official with a small diplomatic contingent out to meet the Americans. When they get there, they exchange pleasantries and then casually ask, and it goes something like this, Hey guys, nice boats you got there. Wow, that's a lot of boats. You guys staying long? I mean, wow, that's an awful lot of guns you got on those boats. I mean, you're not going to use them, are you? Look, I got to tell you guys, the country's closed for business. Company policy, I'm afraid. The boss says no foreigners. I mean, after the whole Jesus thing, it's a bit crazy. So if you could, move along. I mean, we'd put up a no loitering sign, but we've got, over 1,000 miles of coastline. Budget cuts. Am I right? You guys work for the government too, so you know all about budget cuts. I mean, come on. Seriously, let's just keep it civil, right? Okay? Come on. Now, at this point, you'd expect the diplomatic overtures to start. But the Americans, as I'm sure you can gather right now, aren't exactly into negotiating. They're into dictating terms and getting what they want. So, when the local official came aboard to inquire as to their purpose and to advise them of the local laws, which in the case of Westerners is just fuck off, Ambassador Lowe responded with something along the lines of, "We came here to negotiate with your leadership, not trade pleasantries with the Welcome Committee. Your questions and so-called demands will not be addressed until you send an ambassador, or better yet, a regent of the royal family, someone who has the power of the pen to sign treaties. Until you do, we reserve the right to explore the region and conduct scientific research, including, but not limited to, cartographic surveys of your coastline and the mapping of your river systems. Rest assured, we mean no hostile intent whatsoever. We come in peace, and we will not fire a shot unless you shoot at us first." Some of you in the audience may be noticing a pattern here, given what happened literally half an hour ago in the last chapter, but I want you to cast your minds back even further, all the way back to Part 1 and the US involvement in the Opium Wars. Even though we are here to issue demands with the tagline, "or else," the same sort of situation started to develop. No one was really intending to start a war, we're just here for leverage. But the diplomatic process is too slow, and no one is telling anyone what's going on. So while the diplomatic team was assembling at Incheon to hash out a treaty, the Americans did just what they said they'd do. They started mapping out the coastline and exploring the river estuaries. The problem being, of course, the Emperor of Korea had just ordered forts on Ganghwa Island to be beefed up after their brief war against the French, and they have standing orders to fire on any foreign ships attempting to enter the Han River leading to Seoul. Because funnily enough, if tomorrow a Russian, Chinese, or God forbid an Iranian warship started sailing up the Potomac River without permission, straight at the White House, I think the Americans would probably take an issue with it. And the Koreans decided, quite justifiably, to raise their official diplomatic concerns, which they did through a barrage of accurate cannon fire aimed at USS Palos. Naturally, Palos and Monocacy immediately returned fire with American levels of overwhelming force, blowing the fort's main battery to pieces. This started a short but furious gun battle between the gunboats and the local Korean garrison. The Marines, mounted in their smaller steam launchers, escorting the gunboats, started engaging the gunners, with the commander of one of the launchers sniping the Korean commander with his carbine after their launch got tangled in a guideline and drifted too close to shore. Then, not satisfied with killing the field commander, they then noticed the Korean general in charge of the forts, observing them from his headquarters. So, after freeing their boat from the tangled line, they turned the 12-pounder gun on the front of the launch to face him and fired several accurate shots, scoring a near hit that wounded a member of the enemy's general's staff. At this point, the rest of the formation had turned around in the narrow waters, with one of the gunboats having damaged their hull and some rocks in the shallows. It was time to get out of there. So the Marines rejoined their motherships, and the formation returned to the southern end of Ganghwa Island to rejoin the fleet, where they reported the incident to Lowe and Rogers. And sure enough, when they reported the incident, which the rest of the fleet had heard unfolding due to the insane amount of cannon fire in the distance, the response was the inevitable one. Well, would you look at that, fellas? That was a definite case of intentional boat touching. You all saw that, right? Intentional boat touching done by a country we're looking to intimidate. Well, if that don't scream a just cause, I don't know what does. Therefore, on June 2nd, 1871, the Americans issued a formal protest to the Koreans, demanding an apology for the incident and an official explanation. But the issue was more complex than that. Despite the US Navy winning the engagement and successfully withdrawing, if they break off negotiations now, it will look like the Koreans successfully drove them off, meaning the Americans would lose prestige while setting the precedent that America is cool with you killing their citizens as long as they were on a private venture rather than a government one, which would put their concerns in China and Japan at severe risk. The reality was, despite the demand for an apology and the insistence that no hostile intent was meant by their actions, after touching the boats, there really was no way out diplomatically. But they were still willing to give peace a chance, ostensibly. And then, on June 6th, the official Korean response arrived, which read, and once again I'm paraphrasing here, The SS General Sherman violated our territory and committed hostile acts, so we killed them. As for the other day, you sailed warships up to our capital city's main waterway. Of course we fucking shot at you, dumbass. That was entirely your fault. As far as we can tell, you want to invade and occupy us like all the other Westerners. So with all due respect, and believe me, we've given it, more than you deserve, take your trade treaty and shove it up your ass. However, as a demonstration of our generosity, we will provide you the food for your journey home. Our governor will arrive shortly, delivering 3 beef cows, 50 chickens, and 1,000 eggs for your dinner table. Thank you for your visit. Now kindly fuck off. Granted, it was more polite than that, but the message was very clear. You aren't getting your apology. Nah, you're not getting anything. Thus, as it was in the last chapter, cowabunga it was. And on June 10th, 1871, at around midday, the 2 gunboats, USS Palos and Monocacy, sailed towards the various forts that engaged them the previous week, the first one being Chojin Fortress at the mouth of the River Saili, leading into the Han Estuary. Behind these gunboats was the full might of the United States Marine Corps, currently being towed along in their small assault craft, escorted by the steam launchers from earlier. And these Marines weren't just any Marines. These Marines represented the best of the Corps, equipped with brand new breech-loading rifles. If I may use a turn of phrase from my native tongue, they were not here to fuck spiders. Alongside the Marines was an armed Navy shore party numbering 546 officers and men, with a total landing force numbering around 650 personnel, give or take, armed to the teeth with artillery and very, very angry. Seeing this and realizing what was almost certainly about to happen, the Koreans immediately dispatched a junk carrying a diplomatic note, saying, and I'm paraphrasing again, hey, guys, let's not be hasty. We actually still want to negotiate. The other letter was a mistake, we've got diplomats en route. You wanna wait a minute? But it wasn't an apology or an offer of surrender, so they were sent back to the shore. You had your chance, guys. It's now time for consequences. And the dildo of consequences never arrives lewd. USS Palos was the primary tow vessel for the landing force, so she headed towards the landing beaches on the southern shores of Ganghwa Island. USS Monocacy, meanwhile, sailed right up to the fort and opened fire at 500 yards, point-blank range for her heavy guns. Fortress Chojin was utterly obliterated. The walls facing seaward collapsed under the bombardment, the gun positions were demolished along with their crews, and as a result, the Marines made landfall completely unopposed. Things so far had gone completely to plan. But as with every military operation, Judge Advocate General Murphy will eventually make his presence known. And sure enough, when the Navy tried to bring their field guns ashore, they got stuck in the mudflats and seized up entirely, meaning the ground forces would have to rely exclusively on the ships offshore for their fire support. Now this was a serious tactical problem for the Koreans, because if the field artillery is stuck, the gun crews for that artillery will need to enlist the support of their shore parties to get the guns out of the mud, which leaves the Marine Corps contingent without any Navy supervision. I'm pretty sure you all know how this song and dance goes by this point. The Marines immediately fixed bayonets and formed a skirmish line, after which they advanced on the fort in good order. The surviving garrison of Fort Chojin fired a few shots at them, only to receive such a devastating amount of return fire, they quickly ran for their lives. By 2 p.m., the United States Marine Corps had won their first victory on Korean soil. The first of many, as it would turn out later. But they had no time to rest. Their advance continued up the riverbank until they hit the main road leading to the next fort. Dokijin Fortress wasn't really a fortress. It was a fortification not unlike the old Norman forts in medieval Britain. A granite foundation with earthworks and ramparts made out of mud, with gun ports dug into the walls. But given it was late in the day, they were ahead of the main force and they only had one 12-pounder gun they dragged up there themselves. The Marines decided that discretion was the better part of valor, an unusual thing for them. So they set up on the nearest crossroads to cover their flanks and prevent any Korean reinforcements from attacking the naval bridgehead, and dug in for the night. They were right to be concerned. The first wave of Korean reinforcements, the famed Tiger Hunters as mentioned earlier, arrived that night and began engaging in psychological warfare. Stealthing up to the edge of the American perimeter, they started screaming war cries and firing rounds into the encampment in order to scare the Marines into withdrawing, or at the very least, halt their advance. However, what they actually did is deny the US Marines their beauty sleep. Once again, an avalanche of rifle fire and the overworked gun crew of the 12-pounder made their position very clear. We are going to kill you. Sure enough, when they got up at 4 a.m. the next morning and advanced on the fort, the Koreans had abandoned their guns, all of them still loaded, and they had withdrawn to the hills to the north. The Marines called the Navy forward, who brought reinforcements and heavy guns, who then helped them do what they do best: break shit. They spent the next few hours dismantling the forts, breaking the ramparts, spiking the guns, and blowing up the powder magazines. With that done, they advanced north to the main Korean position standing in their path, the citadel of the Gwanseong garrison. It was a running firefight all the way as Korean skirmishers exchanged fire with the Marines from the hills, withdrawing before they could get sucked into a stand-up fight. Eventually, though, by roughly 10 a.m., the Marines and their naval infantry colleagues were assembled outside the fortress, and the Koreans were ready to meet them. But they didn't know just how many Koreans. The Navy was still sailing upriver, so they couldn't attack yet anyway. It was then they did perhaps the most Marine Corps thing I've ever read about. On the main road leading to the front gate of the fortress, the Koreans had set up a myriad of ceremonial banners representing the different units that made up the garrison. The Marines, recognizing the significance of the banners, decided that if they needed to get an accurate estimate of the number of guns, there was only one way to do it. It was time to play Capture the Flag. A squad of Marines who, despite their gargantuan testicles getting in the way, sprinted at full speed, completely unarmed, through a hail of gunfire and started tearing the flags down from their flagpoles. As they did this, the commanding officer, Captain Tilton, counted the number of guns firing at them. They ended up getting 15 flags in all before returning to friendly lines completely unharmed. At which point, the entire assault force of 350 men advanced to a small ridgeline 120 yards to the rear of the fortress. By now, USS Monocacy had gotten into position, and the naval artillery crews had set up on some high ground further back with a perfect field of fire on the citadel. And at 11:30 a.m., all hell broke loose. Every American cannon, both ashore and afloat, started ripping into the Korean position. High explosive, solid shot, even some canister. The artillery batteries mounted on the walls were immediately taken out. Heavy casualties were inflicted, forcing the Koreans to pull back into their interior defenses. Once this was done, the Marines gave the signal for the bombardment to cease, and with the roar of their famous Marine Corps battle cry, "Hoorah!" the entire American assault force stormed across the open field in front of the citadel. Realizing the attack was underway, the Koreans rushed back to their defenses and opened fire, getting there just in time for the initial wave of Marines to breach the walls. Lieutenant Hugh McKee was the first man into the breach at the front of his men. He was killed immediately upon breaching the fort as Korean spearmen stabbed him through the chest. However, his sacrifice drew the enemy's attention long enough for the rest of his squad to pour through the wall behind him. Brutal hand-to-hand combat broke out as the Marines battled their way into the position. The Koreans, having run out of ammunition trying to halt their advance, fought so desperately to repel them, but it was already too late. The rest of the Americans were joining the fray, and it was clear they couldn't push them back. Then, the decisive moment happened. While attempting to rally his men for a counterattack, the Korean general Yo Jae-yeon was killed by a Marine Corps sniper, Private James Doherty, who had climbed atop the fortifications for a better view and spotted someone who looked important. Their leader dead, the perimeter collapsing, and with no ammunition left, the Koreans broke ranks and ran for their lives, only to realize that the US Navy had cut off their retreat, showering them with canister shot as they tried to escape. It was a slaughter, and the Marines pressed their advantage. Using the momentum they'd gained from taking the citadel, they proceeded to capture the two satellite fortifications to the north, bringing the total number of Korean forts captured by US forces to 5, equaling their predecessors' efforts in the Opium Wars. At their feet lay 243 Koreans confirmed killed in action, with another 100 missing and presumed dead by Korea. The rest of the garrison had withdrawn further inland, leaving behind 20 very disheveled and demoralized POWs. And the total number of casualties on the US side? 3 dead and 10 wounded. Oh, and a few shells scratched the paintwork on USS Monocacy, but we don't really count that. However, I think we can all agree that the most impressive thing about this entire engagement is the exploits of Corporal Charlie Brown. Yes, really, Corporal Charlie Brown. Because Corporal Charlie Brown won the Medal of Honor for winning Capture the Flag. He won for all time, because he captured the personal standard of General Jae Yeon, and my god, that's a big flag. Though he wasn't the only one. Private Doherty, who shot the enemy general, got one too, as did 13 other men on the expedition for this engagement. The award had only just been created during the Civil War, and the Distinguished Service Cross didn't exist yet, so its status as the single highest, most venerated medal in the US military hadn't been fully established yet. Nevertheless, the bravery and excellence demonstrated by the Americans that day is truly incredible. However, just like the French expedition, they were only 5 ships and 500 ground troops versus an entire country, and the main Korean army was now en route to Ganghwa. Ambassador Loh tried one last round of diplomacy. Feeling his point had been emphatically made, the response he got was, and I quote directly, "If you come to join battle, in battle we shall meet you." It was apparently no dice. He didn't have the men to invade like Admiral Perry had for Japan, and quite frankly, it wasn't worth the trouble. So the Americans sent one final message to the Koreans along the lines of, "Fine, we're going, but touch our boats again, and we will come back to kill you all." And with that, on July 2nd, 1871, the US Asiatic Squadron weighed anchor and set sail for home, their ultimate objective unfulfilled, yet with a great tactical victory under their belt and an excellent story to tell. Oh, and incidentally, if the North Koreans want to capture their flag back, it belongs to the US Naval Academy Museum in Annapolis, so good luck. Not that they wouldn't be willing to try, as the General Sherman incident and the American expedition to Korea, while completely unknown to most Americans, is remembered as the first episode of the Korean people's eternal struggles against the foreign invader. And while we may laugh at the ridiculous ravings of the communist Kims, there is a group of people far closer to home who have every right to be pissed off about Yankee imperialism. Man, we're going to have to pick up the pace on this video, because it's already taking way longer for the late 19th century than I intended. But the Paraguay and Korean expeditions are so good, I just had to share them in detail. Then again, America fucking around in Central America, as we've established, is a tale as old as time, or at least as old as 1776. In any case, we're going to have to start speedrunning the more well-known events because A, we need to get to the good stuff in the late 20th century, and B, I can't edit a 5-hour video requiring months of research in time for America's birthday. Even so, we're going to have to cover this because it is perhaps the first really big incidence of modern boat touching. Or rather, in this case, alleged or implied boat touching. And yes, this isn't the only time. More on that next episode. Anyway, the year is 1898 and Cuba is on fire. Now, this isn't anything out of the ordinary, as we know. The Cubans have been subjected to one dictator after another for several centuries now. Yet this civil war was shaping up to become the Cuban Civil War. Now, at the time, Cuba was a territory of the Spanish Empire, and the Spanish Empire had been in a state of crippling decline ever since they got utterly ghetto-stomped in the Napoleonic Wars. There were no less than 3 different royal succession wars for the Spanish throne, known as the Carlist Wars. The Spanish themselves went through a national identity crisis, and their economy... You know what? If having a large colonial empire to extract wealth from can't save you, nothing can. And the people in that empire being exploited had started seeing the concept of national identity popping up across the globe. and they thought about how unfair it was that all their money was going to a bunch of gringos who don't understand their dialect, culture, or anything about their day-to-day lives, and naturally drew the conclusion that they should probably rule themselves. Thus, the various Spanish colonies across the globe started rising up throughout the 19th century, the two biggest uprisings taking place in the Philippines and, of course, Cuba. Cuba was particularly aggressive in their struggle for independence, fighting no less than 3 independence wars from the 1860s until the turn of the century. And it's this last one, the big one, led by a group of revolutionaries including José Martí, Maximo Gómez, and Salvador Betancourt, that features in our story today. In late 1894, using a strategy that sounds eerily familiar to one employed by a certain Bostonian president and the Central Intelligence Agency, several ships filled with revolutionaries from across the region with guns acquired in the United States set sail from Florida to invade the eastern shores of Cuba. Most of them were stopped by the US Coast Guard to enforce American neutrality, but one of them made it through. Then, after getting themselves geared up and organized, on February 24th, 1895, the Cuban revolutionaries declared the beginning of their war for national liberation, releasing a manifesto afterwards that called for black freedmen to unify with their fellow working-class Cubans to overthrow the Spanish government and establish a true democratic Cuban republic with equal rights for all and the freedom to pursue their political and economic destiny on their own terms. For the next 3 years, they would wage a brutal guerrilla war against the colonial Spanish regime. Hit-and-run attacks, seizing armories, running guns from the United States with the aid of emigres in Florida, and occasionally engaging the Spanish occupation army in open combat, using their superior mobility, combined with their knowledge of the terrain, to outmaneuver and subsequently decimate them in detail. The Spanish were being humiliated, and when an empire gets humiliated, their first instinct is to relieve the commander in charge so they can shift the blame while looking like they're working towards a solution. And the man they brought in to make this change was General Valeriano Huela, who immediately drew the conclusion that every evil empire draws when they are losing a counterinsurgency war. The solution was genocide. General Huela immediately instituted a strategy the United States would end up using in Vietnam for very similar reasons. In fact, I'm certain it's where they got the idea. The Spanish forces issued a decree that the rural populations of Cuba were to immediately relocate to a designated fortified zone in their local area, usually the nearest major town. Anyone found outside of these zones after a certain date and time will be declared a rebel and summarily shot on sight. These relocations resulted in the creation of ghettos in Cuban cities, guarded by colonial troops, essentially turning them into giant concentration camps, where starvation, disease, and summary executions by the guards weren't just common, they were a daily reality and a fact of life. It's estimated that around 170,000 Cubans would end up dying as a direct result of these methods, with thousands more killed as rebels when they were more than likely just farmers just trying to stay alive as the country burned to the ground around them. However, the Spanish had made a crucial error, the same error General Westmoreland would make half a century later, because they had to contend with something they'd never really dealt with before. The Spanish were about to learn the hard way that the single biggest threat to a tyrannical government is a free press. The United States of America has done some truly incredible things in its history. It's also done some horrible things, more than its fair share. But perhaps its single most important achievement is the First Amendment to their Constitution, a concept so revolutionary for its time, yet something innate to the progress of mankind, that it stands as a monument to the highest aspirations of humanity itself. However, the existence of that amendment allows for something else, something far more dangerous: the beginnings of mass media in the modern world. Now, I know people will be aggressively typing in the comments that the press in some form or another have been a factor in countless wars up to this point. I mean, it's been a factor since the Roman era, if not before. And yes, that's true, the Napoleonic Wars being perhaps the biggest example in this time period. Yet institutional control over the media of the state, the executive authority of monarchies, and the interests of the aristocracy being intertwined with the media apparatus was a massive limiting factor over the editors on Fleet Street in London and, of course, in Paris. Even today, the Daily Mail will bend and break at the word of the establishment should they choose to take that option. The United States, by contrast, was, in a very literal sense, the Wild West. Names like Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst, Charles Dana. These men were the Rupert Murdochs and Ted Turners of their day, and they had a very keen interest in the fate of Cuba. You see, then, as now, the owners of America's newspapers were business magnates, firmly entrenched members of the American bourgeoisie, or to use the modern vernacular, the top 1%. And while Cuba was officially under the sovereign control of the Spanish Empire, the majority of businesses, plantations, and shipping companies operating out of Cuba were owned by Americans, particularly the sugar and tobacco industries, which formed the backbone of the island's economy. And while wars of conquest, colonial wars, and especially proxy wars are excellent for corporate profits, civil wars most definitely aren't, for the simple reason that they tend to happen inside the borders of the country your business is operating in. So when they blow up buildings and burn fields and do acts of terrorism, it's your buildings and fields they're burning, not someone else's. Worse still, while everyone is fighting and dying, the mines, bullets, and cannon shells flying around make operating in Cuba far too risky for the shipping companies who are insured for piracy and natural disasters, but not wars, causing the costs for your entire supply chain to skyrocket, from production to shipping to wages to insurance. All of it goes up. In fact, if you want an example of this, go outside and watch the current news about Iran. This phenomena is not new. Supply and demand versus risk is the oldest economic calculation in the world, and it remains as relevant now as it was then. Thus, the American business class was putting immense pressure on President William McKinley to take decisive action on Cuba to protect American interests. They didn't particularly care how he did it, or who won. All that mattered was restoring stability to the region so they can keep making money. As always,
listen to me, the spice must flow.
The press, however, had their own agenda. And speaking as a YouTuber, I can confirm this from personal experience with the algorithm. War sells newspapers. It's loud, dramatic, gruesome. There are heroes and villains, good versus evil, battles that go down to the wire, triumphs, tragedies. Hell, the drama of war is why this video and this entire channel exists. However, in the case of the press, they don't talk about it in the past tense. They directly influence the political climate of the present. And around the turn of the century, the newspapers held great sway in the centers of political power, particularly in Washington, Boston, and New York. Every day the conflict went on, the press published fantastical accounts of the ongoing conflict. Most of it was comprised of wild exaggerations, of course, but as reports of the crimes against humanity committed by whalers started filtering through, the calls for humanitarian intervention grew louder from the public and in the halls of power. So, the McKinley administration sent out diplomatic feelers to the Spanish, offering to buy Cuba off them as an independent protectorate, or at the very least negotiate a peace deal between the rebels and the colonial government. But the Spanish, despite a more liberal government taking office and removing Weyler from command, refused those terms, making a counteroffer where they'd retain control of Cuba in exchange for greater freedoms for the population and ending the forced relocation programs. A diplomatic stalemate had formed, and the longer the war went on, the more outrageous the press reports became. The most famous example being one of American female tourists being strip-searched by the evil Spaniards, whose degeneracy knows no bounds. Surely an American woman of such means and station could not possibly be affiliated with rebels and desperados. This was an intentional humiliation of good, honest American womenfolk, and we shall not stand for it. Backed into a corner, under pressure from the press, the public, and many of his advisors, William McKinley was forced to take action. Therefore, in January of 1898, on the advice of his Assistant Secretary of the Navy, one Theodore Roosevelt, the USS Maine was dispatched to Havana to protect American interests, provide security for US citizens, and underscore the American position on the war. Basically, knock this shit off or we will knock it off for you. Side note, as all of this was going on, Teddy wired the commander of the Asiatic Squadron, the heroes of last chapter, and he was telling them to head to Hong Kong and load up on coal in preparation for combat against the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, should war break out as a result of this mission, just in case. Food for thought. In any case, the USS Maine arrived in Havana on schedule, and everything seemed fine. Another round of diplomacy started, the sailors were able to get decent tobacco for their pipes for once. Nothing untoward was really happening. Until... On February 15th at 9:40 p.m, the USS Maine exploded in a column of flame, shattering half the windows in Havana, killing 260 officers and men instantaneously as the forward powder magazine ignited, disintegrating the bow of the ship. Of the entire complement of 355 men, only 94 would end up surviving, and of them, only 15 were uninjured. The response from the media was immediate. Headlines of "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain" were plastered across every front page in America. The war hawks of both houses demanded an explanation, and if they found it wanting, it just had to be war. And once again, leading the charge on that front inside the administration was Theodore Roosevelt, who viewed ejecting Spain from Cuba as beneficial to American interests both economically and geopolitically. Control over Cuba would give the United States unmatched power in the Caribbean, paving the way for the American domination of regional trade and security for the long-term imperial projects he had planned. In his particular case, the Isthmus Canal, later to become the Panama Canal. Even so, McKinley still wanted to negotiate with the Spanish to somehow find a peaceful solution to this mess. Yet by now, the wheels were already in motion. The United States Navy called for a public inquiry as to the cause of the explosion aboard the Maine. But in a turn of events we shall see reappear in a certain other incident, an incident involving America's most trusted and beloved ally. The Board of Inquiry was rushed, involved little to no third-party scrutiny, and appeared to have reached a verdict before the investigation even began. Among the entire Board of Inquiry hearings, only one technical witness was called. The rest were eyewitness accounts, who naturally would exclude the possibility of any wrongdoing on their part. A stoker not looking after their fire and an ember getting into the coal bunker, ash from a sailor's pipe starting a smouldering fire which heated the bulkhead next to the powder magazine. Despite these being by far the most likely cause of events as found by academic studies conducted by modern historians, at the time it was ruled that there was only one potential cause: an underwater mine launched by the Spanish. In short, the destruction of the Maine was an act of war against the United States, carried out with deliberate forethought by the Spanish Empire. Needless to say, the public uproar that followed this decision, once again, forced McKinley's hand. Over 100,000 Americans signed up for the Army and Marines the day after the sinking. The Navy put to sea in full line of battle, prepared to engage the Spanish fleet should they react first, and Congress immediately started drafting legislation. There was no avoiding it now. Despite the Spanish already losing the war, despite them actively negotiating with the United States at the time, the American public demanded action. And so, on April 21st, after issuing an ultimatum to Spain, the Spanish government severed diplomatic relations, and the US Navy commenced a blockade of Cuba. Thus began the Spanish-American War. President McKinley called for 200,000 volunteers to join the services. Over 1 million men signed up. Some colleges even offered their students a free credit on their courses if they signed up to fight, and a promise they wouldn't have to pay fees or disrupt their degrees to do it. There was a very real feeling among the Warhawk faction in Congress, especially from people like Teddy, that saw the solution to the failure of Reconstruction and the economic crisis caused by the stock market crashes after the Civil War industrial bubble collapsed as an ultra-patriotic, rally-round-the-flag event. And there's nothing better than a jingoistic war of righteous fury to do that. Especially a jingoistic war you can frame as a moral crusade. And speaking of Teddy, Unlike most politicians, Mrs. Roosevelt didn't raise no bitch. Because as anyone who knows anything about US history can tell you, and fully cognizant of my progressive working class bias, Teddy Roosevelt is quite possibly the biggest Chad in American history. Definitely the best president besides Lincoln. Like, seriously, they put his face on a mountain while he was alive. Granted, it was a gross violation of an indigenous holy site, and an official acknowledgement to the Lakota people must be made there and now in this video in some form. But still, as one of the primary reasons the war broke out, Theodore Roosevelt, like the man he is, did something truly novel in history, not seen since the olden days. He decided that, as a senior government official who advocated for the war, it's only right that he should lead it from the front. So he resigned. He resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, refused appointments to senior staff positions, and enlisted as a lieutenant colonel in the volunteer cavalry, using his political influence not to avoid combat, but the opposite, pulling strings so his unit would be in the first wave of the expedition to Cuba, an assault he was resolved to lead from the front with his saber drawn. However, Teddy would end up leading the first combat of the Spanish-American War in a very different way. Because as mentioned before, one of his last actions as Deputy Sec-Nav was to order the Asiatic Squadron to stock up on coal and ammunition in Hong Kong. And the Asiatic Squadron, upon declaration of war, set sail for Manila, arriving there on May the 1st, 1898. The Spanish had no idea they were coming. They had only just found out they were at war in the first place, and they naturally assumed that the Americans would be sailing pack fleet from San Diego. Worse still, the American consul to the Philippines had provided the commander, Admiral George Dewey, a full map of the Spanish defenses and a readiness estimate of the Spanish naval flotilla in port, which essentially said that the Spanish were on a peacetime watch rotation with like one guy per ship on lookout duty. Manila is a tough harbor to get into in optimal conditions, so the possibility that anyone would be dumb enough to try and infiltrate the port at night was considered remote. Except, A, the consul has just handed them a full map of the defenses, complete with charts, and B, these are American naval officers in the 19th century, who, as we've established, are the living embodiment of fuck it, we ball. So, as they approached Manila on the night of April 30th, the Americans just sailed right into the bay and started picking out Spanish ships in the darkness while getting an accurate gun solution on the shore batteries. Then at around 5:15 a.m. on May 1st, as the sun began to rise, the Spanish lookouts see an entire formation of American warships slowly steaming straight at them. Panic immediately ensues. Ranging shots are fired, followed by scattered independent fire from all the shore batteries. All of it falls short. Men scramble to action stations, but it's already too late. At 5:45 a.m., Admiral Dewey gives the order he's most famous for. Gentlemen, you may fire when ready. The US Asiatic Squadron hits the Spanish with a full broadside from their line of battle. They held the initiative, so they were already set up in perfect formation and just started pummeling everything they saw. Then, when they ran out of harbor, they chucked a U-turn and then hit them with the other broadside. In desperation, the Spanish flagship Cristina, under the command of Admiral Montojo himself, cut her moorings and went full send straight at the US battle line. It was a brave effort, but a vain one, as the much better armed US cruisers simply traversed their guns and subsequently blew her into itty-bitty pieces. After which, Admiral Dewey, in one of the most alpha moves I've ever seen, sent a signal across the squadron. Break contact, boys. It's time for breakfast. Yes, really. The Americans literally paused the battle to grab some coffee and a bacon sandwich before getting back to work. During this break in the action, the Spanish take a look at their situation. Half their flotilla is on fire and sinking. Their flagship is fucked, and the Americans will be back in a few hours to finish the job. Admiral Montojo, realizing his situation was hopeless, pulled his remaining ships back to the harbor and prepared for a final showdown, only for the Americans to rock back up, blast the shore batteries into submission, and then start shelling the government quarter. Yeah, this whole defiant last stand thing wasn't going to work. At 12:40 p.m., the Spanish struck their colors and scuttled their ships, ending the first battle of the Spanish-American War. Final result? 9 Spanish ships sunk with the loss of 77 crew. Total American losses? 1 guy. And that one guy died of a heart attack from the shock of the guns. The reaction back home in the States was electric. Admiral Dewey was hailed as a hero. Congress even created a medal specifically for him, named after him. It was a massive propaganda victory, and it really set the tone for the entire war. The Philippine resistance to occupation were galvanized by such a comprehensive demolition of the Spanish forces in Manila, while the Army and Marines got properly fired up to even the score. They couldn't let the Navy have all the glory. After spending a month training and getting geared up, the American Expeditionary Force set sail for Cuba, with 1st Marines landing in Guantanamo Bay on June 10, 1898, and the 5th U.S. Army Corps landing 2 weeks later to the east of Santiago. This, of course, led to the famous combat actions on the high ground surrounding Santiago, the battles of San Juan and Kettle Hills, where Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders and the African-American Buffalo Soldiers, with the support of state-of-the-art Gatling guns, charged down the Spanish defenders through a hail of accurate fire, winning the first big victory of the land campaign in Cuba. However, the glorious triumph during the ensuing siege of Santiago would end up, ironically, going to the Navy, who, after cornering the Spanish flotilla in the harbor, forced them into a do-or-die charge to escape. The Spanish tried their best, but the fact was the Americans had sent the pride of the Atlantic Fleet to support the invasion, comprised of 5 pre-dreadnought battleships led by the brand new state-of-the-art USS Iowa. All 6 Spanish vessels were sunk, 20% of their crews killed, and the rest taken prisoner. Again, only 1 American was killed, though this time it was actually by enemy action when a well-placed shot hit the forward battery of USS Brooklyn, killing Chief Yeoman George Henry Ellis. By mid-July 1898, it was obvious to everyone that it was only a matter of time before the Spanish colonial forces would have to capitulate. The odds stacked against them were just too high. The American intervention had legitimized the resistance movements across the empire. Guam had surrendered to the US Navy without a fight, and while the Spanish forces on Puerto Rico were mounting an absolutely heroic resistance, without support from the main garrison from Cuba or reinforcements from Spain, they wouldn't be able to hold for long. Therefore, after the siege of Santiago, a protracted guerrilla war across the colonies, and the US Navy accidentally fighting a full-scale battle to capture Manila after the peace treaty was signed, on August 13, 1898, the Spanish-American War came to an end, with Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines joining the United States as territories, while Cuba, due to an act of Congress that probably really pissed off Teddy, was declared an independent American protectorate, with elections held to appoint a civilian government. Excepting, of course, Guantanamo Bay, which was leased to the United States in perpetuity and remains under US control to this day. Finally, after over a century, Alexander Hamilton's revanchist vision of the United States had been realized. No longer were they the upstart power rebelling against their European masters, squabbling with minor powers on the frontiers. The United States was now a truly global geopolitical force. Economically and militarily, they were finally the American Empire. And what followed was absolute chaos, because now there was no other major powers able to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was no longer a defensive measure, it was the imperial will of the United States, which then and now is upheld by its financial and commercial interests. The notional independence of Cuba, as we know, the United States government would prop up a number of dictators, the most infamous being Batista in the country, and the spread of American influence throughout the Caribbean was a boon for American investors. Trading and supply companies across the states started opening up concerns and taking out options on the various stocks being issued for the new enterprises. One such corporation was formed when a Boston agricultural distributor merged with a wholesaler and shipping consortium based out of Costa Rica. They called themselves the United Fruit Company.
Whoa, whoa. Here I come. Oh, here I come. Oh.
And look, while several boat-touching incidents did occur, most notably the Santo Domingo affair, when now President Teddy Roosevelt ordered the Navy to lay the smackdown on the Dominican Republic after they fired on a US shore party, most of the US activities in South America were purely imperialist expeditions as part of what historians call the Banana Wars. And if you want a comprehensive list of US interventions in South America during the early 20th century, someone has already done that for me.
Republic Dominican, Cuba, Caribbean, Greenland, El Salvador to Puerto Rico, Colombia.
Actually, in a conveniently timed copyright strike preventing interlude, I should point out there was also the seizure of the Panama Canal region under direct US control, and a lot of the time the US didn't actually intervene per se. Rather, US corporations funded political oppositions to stage coups, or if it was really necessary, hire death squads to break up plantation unions.
Costa Rica, Belize, Nicaragua, Bermuda, Bahamas, Tobago, San Juan.
Anyway, you get the idea. America was all on board the imperialism train, and it's a good thing they were too. Teddy got the Great White Fleet going, they started multiple beefs with Mexico during their revolution. Everything was looking great if you're a fan of the whole imperialism thing. At least everything was going great until... Alright, so this one is going to be really short, because quite frankly this wasn't a case of boat touching. Rather, Americans were touched while on a boat, namely the Lusitania. However, the declaration of war was caused by the German Empire declaring unilaterally that they were planning to touch America's boats, and Americans, as we know, like to get the first shot in, so they declared war first. The real issue is, of course, that the United States in World War I essentially showed up at the end, fought one or two big battles, and then took all the credit. Which, in fairness, is not exactly their fault. Over 1 million Americans showing up was a major factor in convincing the Germans to throw in the towel. General Pershing and his boys really didn't get much of a chance to play properly, but one has to admit, for the brief time they did spend in proper frontline combat, they definitely made an impression. Regardless, for the sake of my completionist OCD, some bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry, Habsburg's heroes go postal, and the world's messiest family feud breaks out between the various monarchies in Europe. Fast forward nearly a year, and the war has turned into an industrialized slaughterhouse for men and machines, while the United States of America stays officially neutral. It was then, on May 7th, 1915, the RMS Lusitania of Cunard Lines was transiting from the city of New York to the port of Liverpool with a complement of 1,960 passengers and crew on board, nearly 160 of those passengers being Americans, most of them from the middle and upper classes on business. The voyage actually sparked some controversy at the time due to the danger of German U-boat activity in the western approaches, the primary Atlantic shipping lanes into the United Kingdom. Many people questioned the wisdom of such a large-scale passenger voyage taking place during wartime, referencing official statements from the German Navy that ships flying a British ensign, which the Lusitania, as registered in Britain, would be, were to be sunk on sight. The captain and crew laughed it off. Being an ocean liner, they had a much higher top speed than most regular steamers crossing the Atlantic, and Lusitania had escaped even hairier situations before, so they put on a brave face. They didn't tell anyone that due to coal shortages caused by the war, one of their boilers wasn't in use and they were 10 knots slower than they should have been, but hey, the Royal Navy is the largest fleet in the world, and 20 knots is still faster than a submarine, so the risk should be minimal. In fact, the Royal Navy were already tracking most of the submarines operating in the area anyway, including one hanging out off the coast of Ireland, and they had their destroyers out in force. Unfortunately, this was prior to the age of sonar or radio direction finding, so they couldn't tell exactly where the enemy was. And the U-boats had already sunk at least 25 ships in the shipping channel Lusitania was due to transit. But at the time, everything seemed fine on the morning of May 7th. They had received a warning from the Royal Navy that enemy submarines were active in the area. However, they were going at a decent speed and they had land in sight. Then the captain ordered a slight change of course to get a better relative view of a nearby lighthouse to shoot a bearing. For those who don't know how that works, basically you pick a point of reference you can easily identify, turn parallel to it, and then sail a straight course while checking the degree of angle matched with your speed, and then you monitor the changes. Combine that with a range estimate using a rangefinder or a good old-fashioned swag, scientific wild-ass guess, and you can get a pretty accurate navigation fix on your charts. Now this is a perfectly normal maritime procedure. Navigation at sea is hard, and knowing where you are is very important. The problem is, this procedure requires you to sail straight and level with no turns or speed changes for an extended period of time. And for German submarine U-20, the Lusitania had just turned herself into the easiest target a U-boat captain could ask for. At 2:12 p.m, a single torpedo slammed into the side of Lusitania, detonating one of her boilers while sending a torrent of water pouring into the ship, quickly overwhelming the watertight compartments. Lusitania's higher speed as a liner worked against her, as the forward momentum pushed more water into the ship while preventing the survivors from launching the lifeboats. In less than 18 minutes, the once proud ocean liner had slipped beneath the waves, taking almost 1,200 people with her, over 100 of them being among the wealthy American businessmen and their families. For a more comprehensive video on the sinking of Lusitania, I strongly recommend you watch friend of the channel and fellow Australian Mike Brady on his channel Ocean Liner Designs. He regularly works with my more nautically themed colleagues History of Everything and Drakhinifel, while his videos are fully animated with 3D recreations of the various sinkings. His work is top tier and a must-watch for anyone interested in maritime history. In any case, the reaction in the American press was very similar to the Maine. Utter outrage, with many calling it a war crime and a hostile act against the United States. Yet, just as many Americans were of the opinion that the passengers aboard knew the risks and took their chances. President Woodrow Absolute Wilson, meanwhile, held on to the isolationist policy of his government, urging everyone to calm down. As long as the Germans didn't attack the United States directly, there was no reason for them to join the war. So naturally, a team of saboteurs working for the Imperial German Naval Intelligence Service blow up a massive ammunition warehouse in New York Harbor, full of munitions being prepped for shipment to Europe. The explosion caused millions of dollars in damage, killed 7 people, and worst of all, damaged the Statue of Liberty. This happened in July of 1916, and was part of a larger campaign of sabotage against the US arms industry, aiding the Allied war effort. In both a metaphorical and literal sense, the fuse had been lit. All it needed was a spark. And that spark came in January of 1917, when Germany, up against the wall and running out of time, declared unrestricted submarine warfare against all shipping in the North Atlantic, and attempted to bribe Mexico to enter the war on Germany's side in order to prevent the United States from reinforcing the Western Front. This offer was intercepted by British intelligence. This was, of course, the infamous Zimmerman telegram. And so, with boats touched, boats threatening to be touched, and the place where they keep their boats touched, the United States had no choice but to officially declare war against Germany on April 6, 1917. From there, you all know the story. The United States Army and Marines were in no way prepared to fight a modern war. They had no equipment, a small professional army, and no real experience of any kind beyond the odd gunfight with Mexican bandits. Yet now they were expected to cross the world's most forbidding ocean and fight the most experienced, battle-hardened, and militaristic army ever fielded up to that time. So they bought helmets from the British, rifles from Springfield, which stole the design from Germany, and heavy weapons from the French. Once kitted out, they spent 6 months training with Australian and French divisions behind the Western Front, before eventually being sent into battle. And it is here where General Pershing and his men would distinguish themselves, as they performed brilliantly during the Second Battle of the Marne, the Battle of Belleau Wood, and their crowning achievement, the San Miguel Offensive, which involved America's first ever use of combined arms warfare, synchronizing artillery, armor, and aircraft into a perfectly coordinated offensive operation that would end up being the largest single military action in United States history. 500,000 men in a single battle, slamming into German lines and routing them from the field. In a little over 6 weeks, they captured 200 square miles, which in World War I was completely insane. This began a larger offensive in cooperation with both the British and French armies, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which continued until the guns fell silent on the 11th of November, 1918. The American contribution to World War I, while small relative to the other Allied powers, was nevertheless decisive, confronting the Germans with a fait accompli. Despite their victory over Russia, with over 1 million fresh troops backed by a wealthy industrial juggernaut arriving in France, led by an elite cadre of professionals, who produced men like Eddie Rickenbacker, Alvin York, the Harlem Hellfighters, and the original Devil Dogs. The longer the war went on, the worse Germany's situation would get. So the arrival of the United States would prove the decisive factor in Germany's decision to seek terms. Furthermore, the experience gained in World War I would raise an entire cadre of experienced senior officers who would prove invaluable in the wars to come, including the two most polarizing and aggravating general officers in modern American history, George S. Patton and Douglas MacArthur. However, they also got George Marshall out of the deal, so in my estimation, they turned a net profit. The American Expeditionary Force would steadily demobilize in the coming years, with the latest arrivals joining the American forces in Germany, who, alongside the British Army of the Rhine, took on the job of occupying Western Germany during the armistice negotiations. Negotiations which culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on June 28th of 1919. However, not everyone was happy with this result. Many felt that given the arrival of US forces, the Allied forces should have capitalized on their momentum and continued their offensive operations all the way to Berlin, using the fresh wave of manpower to enact the same amount of devastation on Germany as they had inflicted on Belgium and northern France. The Tommies, Legionnaires, and Doughboys who had struggled so hard to break the 4-year deadlock on the Western Front could only sit and watch as German troops formed ranks, raised their banners, and marched back to Germany in perfectly good order and discipline. This sentiment was summed up by Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who, upon the signing of the treaty, was quoted as saying, "This isn't really peace, it is an armistice for 20 years. Well, funnily enough, really? Like, honestly, guys, do I really need to do this? Come on. This is history YouTube. 90% of this platform is World War II history. It's all the new deluge of AI channels talk about. And funnily enough, over half my channel is talking about World War II. If you are watching history on YouTube and you haven't got at least a college freshman's understanding of the Second World War, then you are still in high school. In which case, go to fucking class and stop listening to me. Your teacher works really damn hard. They got a degree in everything. Go to class. If you really want a detailed history of the conflict, I have a full series of documentaries on my channel. You can go watch them all, including probably the most detailed documentary on the German invasion of Norway on the internet. However, if you want my personal recommendation, aside from the self-gratification of watching all of my stuff, go watch the classic documentary series The World at War, narrated by Laurence Olivier, which will forever be better and classier than anything I could ever make, complete with interviews with all the combatants, including Bomber Harris, Albert Speer, everyone. Like, I can't compete with that. But again, for the sake of thoroughness, World War I ends. Millions are dead, while millions more are dying as a plague sweeps the earth and the economy is devastated. Political radicalism is rife in most nations as the far left and far right engage in ideological conflict. However, as conditions improve, extremist movements lose their momentum, and the Roaring Twenties gives hope for the future. Right up to the point corporate America does what it always does and ruins literally everything. They spend money they don't have on risky propositions not backed by market demand. Then the US government puts tariffs on everything to compensate for the falling rate of profit, which, to the shock of absolutely no one who understands how international trade works, crashes the global economy. The effects of this crash are so catastrophic, the radicals who were losing relevance suddenly surge in popularity. In Europe, some dude with a big chin wants to end poverty by restoring the Roman Empire, while another with a shit mustache thinks Germany losing the war and the Great Depression were caused by the Jews. Meanwhile, in Japan, the economic crash is nigh on apocalyptic. The military essentially seizes control of the Diet, assassinates several prime ministers, and then annexes Manchuria. Once done, they build up their strength for a brief period and then engineer a false flag attack, inciting a border conflict near Beijing in order to justify a full-scale invasion of China, which they do without the Emperor's permission or the authority of the civilian government. The United States condemns the invasion and starts supporting China, sending financial and military aid. As all this is happening, the Italians invade Ethiopia using chemical weapons on the population. The Germans annex a third of Central Europe without firing a shot because the other powers disarmed themselves like idiots and didn't read the warning signs of impending fascism, which had the rather predictable result of said fascists realizing they could in fact just invade Europe. What no one saw coming, though, was them teaming up with their mortal enemies, the Communists, to do said invasion, leading to the Soviet Union underwriting the German war economy as they successfully invade and conquer almost all of continental Europe. And with continental Europe under fascist control, the ultra-militarist government in Japan takes the opportunity to form an alliance with them in order to justify them annexing the resource-rich colonies of the countries under German occupation. This, combined with the fact that Britain is tied down fighting the Axis in a 2v1, means Japan now has a free hand in the Pacific, which scares the shit out of the United States, who in response to all of this, as well as Japanese atrocities in China, including the mass employment of biological weapons against civilians, and chemical munitions against civilians, starts arming the Allied powers while embargoing Japan of all raw materials usable in war production, most crucially, oil. And with the United States throwing their weight around, not to mention Britain blockading Germany, the Axis had one option: the George Bush maneuver, aka go get some oil. So in the most predictable plot twist in human history, the fascists betray the communists and invade the Soviet Union. But at the same time, the Japanese declare a non-aggression pact with the USSR after the Red Army absolutely bodies the Japanese army in Manchuria during a border skirmish. However, that means they can't go north to get natural resources, leaving them with only one other option: go south. And well, it went like this. Which led to this. So the Americans did this. Which in turn resulted in this. And meanwhile, in Europe, as all that was going on, then there's Africa, and let's not forget the air war. Eventually, though, the Allies turn the tables, which leads to this. This. And finally, this. But the Pacific was still going on, of course, which involved this. 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 Culminating, of course, in this. The end. Oh, wait a minute. We forgot about Europe. Hold on. There we go. Happy endings all around. However, as the dust settled from the greatest war in humanity's history, a new threat was already emerging. The shadows of the next war were flickering on the wall, a shadow cast by a nuclear light. It was clear the only way to save the land of the free from Armageddon was to prevent a war from happening, and the only way to do that was to stop the threat of communism before it had a chance to grow. Yet as we've demonstrated, that usually requires a boat to be touched in order to justify it to the public. And by now, no one would be dumb enough to do that. Which leaves only one option. We're just going to have to lie about our boats getting touched, or if necessary, touch them ourselves. But that is a story for next time. I don't want to kill the vibe on your special day. You've done so well. Happy 250th birthday, America. I hope you enjoy it, and I'll see you next time.